Hello, my friend. Whatever brought you here tonight, I'm so glad you're here. If these quiet journeys into the past have ever helped you relax or drift off to sleep, a like and a subscribe help this little channel find someone else who needs it too. It costs you nothing, and it means more than you might think. While you settle in, tell me where you're listening from tonight. Maybe it's a rainy evening in Vermont, a quiet cottage somewhere in Yorkshire, or a crisp winter night in Hobart with a blanket pulled up to your shoulders. Leave it in the comments if you feel like it. I genuinely enjoy reading every single one. All right, love, dim the lights. Let your shoulders relax. Are you comfortable? Good. Let us begin. The apartment belongs to the Marquise Isabelle de Beaumont, and at this hour, past 10 in the evening, only a handful of candles remain lit in it, clustered near the far end of the bedchamber where she sits at her dressing table half undone from the day. Her husband, the Marquis Etienne de Beaumont, is 2 rooms away, in his own chamber, where a valet is working the buttons of his coat loose one by one. They have been married 11 years. They have apartments at Versailles because Etienne's grandfather did something useful for a king 2 reigns ago, and the family has been quietly, carefully useful ever since, which is the only kind of nobility that lasts at a place like this. Here is the first thing worth knowing about a home at Versailles, and it surprises almost everyone who has not stood inside one. It is small, not the palace itself, which sprawls outward in every direction until the eye gives up trying to measure it, but the actual apartments, the actual rooms where families like the Beaumonts eat, sleep, dress, argue, and raise their children. Isabelle's entire household, husband, herself, 2 children and 4 servants, live across 5 rooms on the 2nd floor of the north wing, rooms that a wealthy merchant in Paris would have considered modest. The ceilings are high, yes, and the windows look out over a section of garden that most visitors to the palace will never see. But the actual square footage is closer to a comfortable townhouse than a palace in the way people imagine it. Space at Versailles is not measured in acres, it is measured in proximity. How close is your window to the king's? How many doors stand between your bedchamber and his council room? That is the real currency here, and Isabelle's family has just enough of it to matter, and just little enough of it to have to work at keeping it. She sits now with her hair half taken down, one lady's maid, a woman named Claudine who has been with her since before her marriage, working a silver comb through the last of the pins. The candlelight does something particular to the room at this hour, throwing long soft shadows up the papered walls, catching on the gilt frame of a small painting near the door, a portrait of Isabelle's mother that travelled with her from Burgundy when she married into this family. It is the one object in the room that is entirely hers, untouched by the Beaumont name, and she glances at it now the way she does most nights, without quite meaning to. Claudine sets the comb down and begins unlacing the back of Isabelle's bodice, her fingers quick and practised, the kind of motion that no longer requires looking. This is the part of the evening most people imagine when they picture a noble woman undressing, an elaborate procession of silk and whalebone and someone else's careful hands, and there is truth in that image, but it moves faster than people think. 2 minutes, maybe 3, and the outer layers are gone, folded over Claudine's arm, carried toward the wardrobe that takes up most of the far wall. Isabelle sits in her shift now, arms crossed loosely over her chest against the evening chill, watching her own reflection in the small mirror propped against the table. She does not linger on it. She has stopped being surprised by her own face some years ago, the way most people eventually do. From somewhere below, through the window she keeps cracked even in autumn, comes the sound of a cart on gravel, wheels catching on stone, a driver's low voice saying something to the horse. Deliveries still move through the palace grounds at this hour, candles and linen and firewood, the unglamorous machinery that keeps 4,000 people fed and lit and warm, and Isabelle has grown so used to the sound that she barely registers it anymore. It is simply the noise Versailles makes at night, low and constant, like breathing. Down the corridor, in his own chamber, Etienne is having a rather different sort of evening. His valet, a young man named Bertrand, who has held the post only since the spring, is folding a coat that cost more than most Parisian tradesmen earn in a year, and Etienne is talking, the way he often does at this hour, half to Bertrand and half to no one in particular, working through the events of the day out loud. There was a dinner tonight, a small one, 8 guests, hosted by a duke whose favour Etienne has been courting for the better part of 2 years. It went well enough. It did not go brilliantly. Etienne has learned to feel the difference in his stomach before he can name it in words, and tonight it sits somewhere between the two, a low simmer of dissatisfaction he cannot quite locate the source of. This is the part of noble life at Versailles that the paintings never show you, and it deserves a moment's pause. Every single evening, every dinner, every walk through a garden path timed to intersect with the right person, every seemingly idle conversation carries weight. Nothing here is truly relaxed, not even the leisure. A man like Etienne cannot simply enjoy a meal. He must also calculate quietly, constantly, whether the meal moved him closer to or further from the things his family needs, a better post, a better marriage for his daughter one day, the king's eye lingering on him for half a second longer than it lingers on someone else. It is exhausting in a way that has nothing to do with physical labour, and it never fully stops, not even here, not even now with his coat half off and his voice trailing into something quieter as Bertrand works the last button free. Down the hall, in a smaller room tucked between her parents' chambers, the Beaumont children are already asleep or close to it. Their names are Marguerite, who is 9, and Julien, who just turned 6, and they share a governess named Madame Fontaine who sleeps in the room adjoining theirs, close enough to hear if either child stirs in the night. Marguerite has a habit of talking in her sleep, brief nonsensical fragments that Madame Fontaine has stopped trying to interpret, and tonight is no exception. A few soft words drifting out into the dark before she settles again. Julien sleeps the way small children often do, entirely without ceremony, one arm flung above his head, a stuffed rabbit missing one ear tucked somewhere near his shoulder. Isabelle looks in on them most nights before she retires herself, a habit that predates any of the formal child-rearing philosophies fashionable among her set, which generally hold that a noble mother's involvement should be limited, supervisory, mostly ceremonial. She does not care much for that fashion. She was raised by a mother who held the same view, distant and correct and entirely absent from the daily texture of Isabelle's childhood, and Isabelle decided, somewhere in the early exhausted months after Marguerite's birth, that she would not repeat it exactly. Not entirely. She still has a governess, still has nurses when the children were smaller, still follows most of the expected forms. But she comes to this room most nights anyway, quietly, after Claudine has gone, and stands for a moment in the doorway just to look. Tonight she does the same, wrapped now in a dressing gown, candle in hand, casting her shadow long across the nursery floor. Julien's rabbit has slipped from the bed entirely, and she crosses the room without thinking about it, and tucks it back beside him, the small automatic gesture of 1,000 other nights. Marguerite stirs slightly at the light, but does not wake. Isabelle stands there a moment longer than she needs to, the candle throwing warm, unsteady light across 2 sleeping faces that look, in this particular hour, almost nothing like the small formal versions of themselves that get presented at court, occasions 3 or 4 times a year, dressed in miniature versions of adult fashion, taught to curtsy and bow on cue. This is the real version. This is the one she keeps for herself. There is a particular object on the mantel in the children's room that deserves a mention, a small enamel box chipped slightly at one corner that holds nothing more valuable than a handful of Julien's baby teeth and a lock of Marguerite's hair from her first haircut. It has no monetary worth whatsoever, would fetch perhaps a few sous if sold, and yet Isabelle would save it before nearly anything else in the apartment if the building somehow caught fire tonight. Versailles is full of objects worth staggering sums, gilt clocks and porcelain and silver that would beggar most French villages if auctioned off, and none of them mean anything close to what that small chipped box means to her. This is a thing almost nobody talks about when they describe noble life here. The strange quiet gap between what a household owns and what a household actually treasures, and it is rarely the same list. She returns to her own chamber eventually, and Claudine has already turned down the bed, the heavy embroidered coverlet folded back in a neat triangle, the sheets beneath it linen so fine it barely registers as fabric against skin, more like a second layer of air. This is one of the genuine luxuries of a life like Isabelle's. one of the ones that holds up under scrutiny even once you strip away all the performance and pressure surrounding it. The sheets really are extraordinary. The bed really is warm within moments, heated earlier by a copper pan filled with coals that a servant carried through and slid between the layers an hour before, then withdrew, leaving only the warmth behind. There is a particular pleasure in climbing into a bed that someone else has already warmed for you, a small act of care that Isabelle has never quite stopped noticing, even after 11 years of it being simply how her nights begin. Before she lies down fully, she crosses to the window one more time, drawing back the heavy curtain just far enough to look out. The gardens beyond her apartment are dark now, mostly. The elaborate parterres and gravel paths that fill with strolling courtiers by afternoon, reduced at this hour to shapes and shadows, geometry without colour. Somewhere far off, in another wing entirely, a window is still lit, gold against the dark, and she wonders briefly, the way she sometimes does, whose room that is, what conversation or argument or quiet private grief is keeping someone else awake at this hour too. Versailles holds thousands of people within its walls most nights, and there is something Isabelle finds strangely comforting in that number. The knowledge that whatever she is feeling in this particular moment, someone else in this enormous building is very likely feeling some version of it too. There is a rule at Versailles that governs almost everything, one so deeply embedded in daily life that most of the people living under it have stopped noticing they are following it at all, and it is this. Nothing may appear effortful. A courtier may spend 4 hours preparing for an appearance that lasts 20 minutes, may rehearse a sentence a dozen times before saying it aloud, may calculate the precise angle of a bow down to the degree, and none of that labour is permitted to show. The entire performance depends on looking as though it costs nothing. Isabelle learned this rule before she learned to read properly, absorbed it the way children absorb the unstated logic of the household around them, and by the time she arrived at Versailles as a young bride of 19, it was simply how she moved through a room. Effort is common, ease is noble. That is the whole equation, and nearly everything about daily life here, the clothing, the conversation, the elaborate rituals of greeting and departure, exists in service of maintaining that illusion. It costs something, this rule, though nobody says so out loud. Isabelle thinks of it sometimes late at night, the way she's thinking of it now, propped against her pillows with the candle nearly guttered beside her. The cost is a kind of permanent vigilance, a watchfulness that never fully switches off, not at dinner, not at chapel, not even, if she's honest, in moments like this one, alone in her own bed, where some small habitual part of her mind is still half arranging her face into the correct expression for nobody at all. Her thoughts drift, as they sometimes do at this hour, to something she has told almost no one, not even Etienne, not in any real detail. 2 years ago, before Julian's 6th birthday, she lost a child partway through a pregnancy. Quietly, at home, without the household ever fully understanding what had happened beyond a vague sense that the Marquise had been unwell for a fortnight, and then, gradually, was not. Court life does not have a place for that kind of grief, not publicly. A woman is expected to recover, to reappear at the appropriate function within a reasonable window, to say nothing that would make anyone else at a dinner table uncomfortable. Isabelle did exactly that. She reappeared. She said nothing. And she has carried the particular weight of that silence ever since, not because she thinks she was wrong to keep it private, but because there has never been a single moment in 2 years when she was permitted to simply set it down. She does not think of this every night. Most nights, honestly, she does not think of it at all, and there is no drama in her remembering it now, no fresh wave of anguish, just a quiet acknowledgement, the way you might notice an old scar while washing your hands, there and then gone again. She blows out the candle. The room settles into full dark, and somewhere beyond the window, faint and constant, the palace continues its low nighttime murmur, unconcerned, as it always is, with any single person's private weather. Morning at the Beaumont apartment arrives slowly and almost entirely without the family's own effort. A servant enters Isabelle's chamber a little before 8, drawing back the curtains, coaxing the banked coals in the small bedroom hearth back into a proper fire, setting out a tray with chocolate, thick and dark. The particular luxury item that has become almost obligatory among fashionable women of Isabel's set over the past decade. She does not rise immediately. This is another detail people rarely picture correctly when they imagine a noblewoman's day. The sheer amount of time spent simply reclining, awake, unhurried, receiving small services one after another before any actual motion begins. Isabel drinks her chocolate in bed, reads 2 letters that arrived overnight by courier, one from a cousin in Lyon complaining at length about a disagreeable neighbour, the other from her own mother, brief and characteristically distant, mostly concerned with whether Marguerite has begun her formal dancing instruction yet. It is nearly 9 before Isabel actually rises, and the process that follows, the full toilette, is worth describing honestly, because it is both more elaborate and more mundane than most people imagine. Claudine returns, along with a second maid, a younger woman named Perrine who has been with the household barely a year. Between them, they manage the whole operation with an efficiency that Isabel has stopped consciously observing, though she remembers distinctly how disorienting it felt in her first months of marriage, having other hands do so much of what she had always done herself as a girl in her father's much smaller household in Burgundy. The powder is the part visitors to this era always ask about first, and it deserves a moment of real attention, because the process is stranger and more involved than people generally realize. Isabel's hair, worn close and simply styled most days, unlike the towering architectural creations reserved for grand court occasions, gets a light dusting of powder from a small bellows device that Perrine works with practiced care, a fine cloud settling into the strands, giving them the pale, slightly grey-toned finish that fashion currently demands. The powder itself is mostly ground starch, occasionally scented with orris root or lavender, and it gets everywhere, on the shoulders of whatever gown Isabel happens to be wearing, on the floor beneath her chair, faintly in the air of the room for an hour afterward. There is a particular smell to a noble household in the mid-morning, powder and beeswax and the chocolate still lingering from breakfast, and it is not a smell that appears in any painting, though Isabel would recognize it blindfolded, has recognized it in fact, blindfolded, on the rare morning she has kept her eyes closed through the whole process, simply to steal a few more minutes of something like rest. Her face receives less attention than fashion of a generation earlier would have demanded. The heaviest, most theatrical use of white lead paint and rouge belonged more to her mother's era and to the most extreme court occasions. On an ordinary morning, Isabel wears very little, a touch of colour at the lips, perhaps, nothing more, and this too is a small quiet rebellion against a fashion she has always found faintly absurd, the idea of applying a mask before breakfast. She saves the fuller version, the elaborate one, for evenings that actually require it. Getting dressed itself takes perhaps 20 minutes once the undergarments are settled, a process both maids handle with the coordinated efficiency of long practice, lacing, fastening, adjusting, and Isabel stands through most of it with her arms slightly raised, a posture she has held so many thousands of times across 11 years of marriage that her body assumes it now almost without conscious thought. The gown chosen for today is nothing especially grand, a morning dress in a soft dove grey, appropriate for the kind of day that holds no formal court appearance, only the ordinary business of managing a household and perhaps a visit or two. And that, notably, is where the topic of dressing ends for this particular morning, because something else has already begun to pull Isabel's attention elsewhere. From the outer room comes the sound of Etienne's voice, raised slightly, not in anger exactly, more in the particular tone of a man discovering an inconvenience before he has had proper coffee. A letter has arrived, delivered by a footman still slightly out of breath from the stairs, and Isabel can hear enough of her husband's half of the exchange to gather that it concerns money, as it so often does these days. This is worth pausing on, because it complicates the picture people usually carry of families like the Beaumonts, gliding through gilded rooms without a single practical worry touching them. The truth is considerably less comfortable, maintaining a presence at Versailles, keeping apartments furnished to the appropriate standard, dressing the whole household in the appropriate fashions, hosting the occasional dinner that must never look as though it strained the family's resources, even when it very much did, All of it costs an amount of money that the Beaumont estate, a respectable but not enormous property in the countryside near Chartres, does not entirely generate on its own. Etienne has spent much of the past 2 years quietly, carefully in debt to 2 different Parisian bankers, a fact that perhaps 6 people in the world know anything about, and Isabelle is one of them, though even she does not know the precise sum. She crosses to the doorway between their rooms now, still fastening the last button at her wrist, and finds Etienne standing by the window with the letter in one hand, his expression carefully arranged into something neutral before he even notices her there, an old habit, the same instinct toward composure that governs nearly everything he does in this building. It is only a minor matter, he tells her, a payment on a note coming due sooner than expected, nothing that cannot be managed. She believes him, mostly because she has learnt over 11 years which of his reassurances carry real weight and which are simply the automatic shape his voice takes when he wants a subject closed. This one sits somewhere in between, and she lets it go for now, the way she generally does, filing the worry away in the same quiet interior place where she keeps most of the things she carries without discussing. There is a particular skill involved in managing a household's finances at this level of society, one that falls disproportionately, though rarely officially, on the women, and Isabelle has become quietly expert in it over the years, even though no one would ever describe her that way at a dinner party. She knows precisely which small economies can be made without anyone outside the household noticing, reusing the trim from a gown rather than purchasing new, serving one fewer course at a private family dinner while keeping every public dinner exactly as lavish as expectation demands, delaying a payment to a favoured dressmaker by a fortnight while ensuring the woman never feels slighted enough to gossip about it. None of this shows. None of this is meant to show. It is in its own way, its own version of the rule that governs everything else here. Effort concealed beneath the appearance of ease, except this particular effort belongs almost entirely to Isabelle, unpaid and unacknowledged, running quietly beneath the visible surface of a household that from the outside looks as untroubled as any other apartment in the north wing. By mid-morning, the household's rhythm has shifted toward its more social obligations, and this is where a day at Versailles begins to reveal its true architecture, because so little of noble life here is actually private. Isabelle receives 2 visitors before noon, both women of roughly her own rank, both visits conducted with a warmth that is entirely genuine on the surface and entirely calculated underneath, a distinction that stops feeling contradictory once you have lived inside this world long enough. The first visitor is a marquise named Celeste de Beaumont, a woman Isabelle has known since both were girls newly arrived at court, and their friendship, while real, has always run alongside a current of quiet competition that neither woman would ever name aloud. Celeste's husband holds a slightly better position at court than Etienne does, a fact both women are perfectly aware of and neither has ever once mentioned directly in 11 years of friendship. The conversation moves through the expected channels: children, an upcoming wedding in another family entirely, a mild complaint about the quality of fabric currently available from a particular merchant in Paris, and beneath all of it runs the real business of the visit, which is information gathering, conducted so smoothly that an outside observer might miss it entirely. Celeste mentions, almost in passing, that she has heard the Duke of Neric is considering a new appointment to his household staff, a position that would carry real influence, and watches Isabelle's face carefully as she says it, gauging whether the Beaumont family already knows this, whether Etienne is already positioning himself for it. Isabelle, for her part, receives this information with practiced neutrality and files it away instantly, already composing in her mind how she will raise it with Etienne later, casually, over dinner, as though she had only just thought of it. This is the actual texture of female friendship among the nobility at Versailles, warmer and more truly affectionate than cynics tend to assume, but never entirely free of this undercurrent, this constant quiet exchange of useful information disguised as gossip. Isabelle likes Celeste. She has liked her for 2 decades, and she has also, on at least 3 occasions that she can recall clearly, withheld a piece of information from her that might have given the Vaugirard family an advantage, because the 2 families' interests, however friendly the women themselves remain, do not always point in the same direction. Nobody would call this dishonest. It is simply how the game is played, and every woman in this wing of the palace has learnt to play it before she turned 20. The second visitor arrives just as Celeste is leaving. A slightly awkward overlap in the doorway that both women manage with the kind of practiced grace that makes the awkwardness invisible to anyone but themselves. This visitor is older, a widowed countess named Adelaide, who has lived at Versailles for nearly 40 years and has over that time become something like a walking archive of the place. Every family's history, every old scandal, every alliance and quarrel stretching back decades. Isabelle really enjoys her company in a way that feels less complicated than the visit with Celeste, because Adelaide, at her age and with her particular kind of security, has largely stopped playing the more exhausting version of the game. She says what she thinks. It is, Isabelle has come to realize, one of the rarest luxuries available in this building, rarer than any gown or jewel, the simple freedom to speak plainly. Adelaide has brought news too, though hers arrives without any of Celeste's careful strategic packaging. She tells Isabelle bluntly, over a cup of the chocolate that Perrin brings in, that there is talk, real talk, about a certain young woman recently arrived at court whose favour with a particular gentleman has become impossible to ignore, and that the gentleman's wife, a woman Isabelle knows only slightly, has taken to appearing at every public function, looking as though she has not slept in a week. This is the other current running constantly beneath the surface of Versailles, quieter than the political manoeuvring, but arguably more consuming, the tangled private lives that everyone observes and almost no one discusses directly, at least not to the people actually living through them. Isabelle listens, makes the appropriate sounds of sympathy, and privately feels a small complicated wave of gratitude for her own marriage, imperfect as it is in its own quiet ways, at least free of that particular public humiliation. She and Etienne have their difficulties, the money, the long stretches of formal distance that court life seems to encourage even between people who sincerely care for one another, but they have never given the palace this kind of spectacle to feed on, and she finds herself, listening to Adelaide's account, holding on to that small mercy a little more tightly than usual. By early afternoon, the household turns toward the day's main meal, and this is worth slowing down for, because dining at Versailles operates by a logic almost entirely foreign to how meals work anywhere else. The Beaumonts do not eat in isolation, not today, not most days. They dine with two other families, an arrangement fairly common among households whose apartments sit close together and whose social standing runs roughly parallel, sharing both the considerable expense and the considerable labour of a proper noble table. Today's meal is hosted in the Beaumont apartment itself, which means the morning's quiet financial worry has a very immediate, very practical shadow following it through every course. The table, when Isabelle finally sees it fully laid, is a small production of its own. White linen, pressed that morning by a servant whose entire job for several hours consisted of nothing else. Silver that has been in the Beaumont family for 3 generations, polished until it throws back distorted little reflections of the candlelight even at midday, when the heavy curtains are drawn part way to control the glare through the windows. There are perhaps 9 courses planned for this particular meal, not because 9 courses will actually be consumed in any real quantity, but because the presentation of abundance matters here nearly as much as the food itself. A soup arrives first, a delicate broth flavoured with herbs from the palace's own kitchen gardens, followed by a fish course, then 2 separate meat courses, one of fowl, one of a small roasted joint, interspersed with vegetables prepared in the elaborate, labour-intensive style currently fashionable, and finally a procession of sweet dishes, a custard, a small tart, sugared almonds, arranged in a careful pyramid on a silver dish that has travelled the length of the table at every meal Isabelle has hosted since her marriage. Here is the detail that tends to surprise people most, though, and it deserves a moment's attention. Almost nobody at this table actually eats very much. Fashion among noble diners at this period favours small portions, delicate, almost performative bites, the same underlying logic as everything else here, effort concealed, hunger concealed, any suggestion of real bodily need carefully smoothed away beneath elegant restraint. A woman seen eating heartily risks a particular kind of quiet judgment, and Isabelle, like every other woman at this table today, has learnt to manage her own appetite in public, with the same practiced discipline she applies to her expression, her posture, her tone of voice. She will eat properly later, privately. A plate brought to her own chamber in the evening once the performance of the day has concluded. This afternoon, at this table, she takes small portions of nearly everything and finishes almost none of it, and nobody at the table finds this strange in the slightest, because everybody else is doing exactly the same thing. The conversation across the meal moves, as it always does, through several distinct registers. There is polite discussion of a recent performance at the Palace Theatre, a light disagreement about the merits of a particular composer currently fashionable, a longer, more careful conversation about a piece of political news from the frontier that the men at the table handle with visible caution, aware that opinions expressed too freely at a dinner table have a way of travelling further than intended, and beneath all of it, threaded through nearly every pause in the formal conversation, the same undercurrent that ran through Isabel's morning visits, small exchanges of information, small assessments of who seems to be rising, who seems to be falling, conducted so smoothly that a stranger seated at this table might miss almost all of it entirely, hearing only pleasant conversation among friends. One of the other families at the table, the Montclairs, brings a piece of news partway through the meal that shifts the room's temperature slightly, the kind of small social earthquake that ripples outward from a single sentence. The Comte mentions, with studied casualness, that his family has recently secured a promise of a minor court appointment for their eldest son, a position that several other families at this table, including Isabelle, understands immediately the Beaumonts had also been quietly hoping to secure. Etienne's face does not change. This is, itself, a kind of performance, the visible effort of appearing entirely unaffected by news that has in fact landed like a small stone dropped into still water. Isabelle watches her husband manage this moment with the same practiced ease he applies to nearly everything in public, offering polite congratulations that sound, to anyone not paying close attention, completely sincere. It is only much later, once the guests have gone and the servants have cleared the last of the dishes, that Etienne allows himself to show any of what he actually felt sitting across that table, and even then, only slightly, a tightness around his eyes, a certain clipped quality to his voice as he discusses the afternoon with Isabelle in the relative privacy of their own sitting room. This is one of the quiet costs of a life built so thoroughly around performance, Isabelle thinks, watching him. The feelings do not disappear simply because they were never permitted to show. They just wait, patiently, for the few private moments each day when there is finally somewhere safe to set them down. The afternoon carries its own separate obligation, one that has nothing to do with the household itself and everything to do with simply being seen. This is perhaps the strangest feature of daily life at Versailles to modern ears, the idea that appearing in certain public spaces at certain hours constitutes its own form of labour, as demanding in its way as any physical task, and Isabelle prepares for it now with the same care she gave her morning toilette, though the change of dress is smaller, a slightly more formal overlay added to what she already wore, a fan collected from a drawer, a different arrangement of the small amount of jewellery she owns. The Hall of Mirrors at mid-afternoon is not the hushed, reverent space that visitors centuries later will file through in near silence, cameras raised. It is loud, it is crowded. Courtiers move through its length in a constant slow current, greeting one another, pausing in small clusters of conversation, angling themselves, always, toward whichever direction offers the best chance of being noticed by someone whose notice matters. Isabelle walks it now with Etienne beside her, the two of them moving at the particular unhurried pace that signals confidence rather than urgency, stopping twice to exchange a few words with acquaintances, careful never to appear as though they are searching for anyone more important, even when, in fact, they are. That sheer scale still, after 11 years, produces a small physical reaction in her, a kind of pressure behind the sternum that she has never quite named. Hundreds of candles multiplied endlessly by the mirrors lining one entire wall, the garden beyond the windows opposite stretching out in its impossible geometric perfection, the whole space designed, quite deliberately, to make an ordinary human body feel simultaneously important and completely insignificant, chosen enough to stand here and utterly small against the scale of it. She has never fully adjusted to that particular sensation, and privately, she suspects nobody ever entirely does, no matter how many years they spend walking this same stretch of parquet floor. Here is a detail almost nobody expects, though, and it deserves its moment, because it complicates the grandeur in a way that Isabelle finds almost comforting. For all its mirrored splendor, this palace has a persistent, well-documented problem with basic sanitation. Proper plumbing simply does not exist in any modern sense. Chamber pots are emptied by servants throughout the day, sometimes, in less careful moments, simply into stairwells or corners of courtyards when the nearest proper disposal point feels too far away, and the result is a building that, for all its visual magnificence, carries an underlying smell that period visitors wrote about with real, sometimes comic dismay. Isabelle has grown so accustomed to it that she truly does not notice most days the way a person stops smelling their own home after enough years inside it, but she remembers vividly the shock of it during her very first weeks here as a young bride, the gap between the palace she had imagined from a distance and the actual sensory experience of living inside it. Perfume solves a good deal of this, practically speaking, and perfume at Versailles deserves to be understood not simply as a luxury, but as something closer to a functional necessity. Isabelle carries a small vial of scent, orange blossom mixed with something warmer underneath, applied that morning and refreshed once more before this walk through the gallery, and nearly everyone around her is doing some version of the same thing, a constant layered cloud of competing florals and musks drifting through the crowded hall, itself becoming, after enough exposure, simply another texture of the building, rather than something anyone consciously registers. The walk through the gallery accomplishes its purpose within perhaps 20 minutes, a brief exchange with a minister's wife that Etienne handles with careful warmth, a moment where the king himself passes at a distance, close enough for a proper bow, far enough that no actual conversation occurs, which is in fact exactly the outcome most courtiers hope for on an ordinary afternoon. Actual direct conversation with the king carries enormous weight and enormous risk in equal measure. A respectful bow at the correct distance, acknowledged with the smallest incline of the royal head, accomplishes nearly everything a family like the Beaumonts actually needs from a day like this. Visible proximity, visible acknowledgement, without the exposure of an actual exchange that could go badly in ways too numerous to fully calculate. By the time Isabelle and Etienne return to their own apartment, the light outside has shifted toward the long gold slant of late afternoon, and there is a genuine physical relief in stepping back through their own door, shedding the public version of themselves the way one might shed a heavy coat. Etienne loosens his cravat almost immediately, a small gesture that would be unthinkable in the gallery and is simply ordinary here, and Isabelle feels her own shoulders drop a full inch, a tension she had not fully registered as tension until the moment it began to release. The children are brought to see their parents briefly in the early evening, a ritual that occupies perhaps half an hour and matters enormously to Isabelle despite its brevity. Marguerite has spent the afternoon with a dancing master, practicing the careful formal steps that will eventually be required of her at actual court functions, still some years off but already being prepared for with real seriousness. She demonstrates a small portion of what she has learnt now in the sitting room, her small feet moving through the pattern with a concentration that makes both her parents smile despite the day's various pressures. Julian, meanwhile, has spent his afternoon with a tutor beginning the earlier stages of Latin, a subject he has decided at 6 that he does not care for in the slightest, and he says so now, bluntly, with the particular fearless honesty that children possess before the world teaches them to conceal it. Etienne laughs at this, a real laugh, unguarded in a way that Isabelle notices and treasures precisely because it happens so rarely within these walls. This is one of the genuine pleasures of the household, small and private and entirely outside the machinery of court, the ordinary texture of a family simply being a family for half an hour before the demands of the evening resume. Marguerite asks, with the particular persistence of a 9-year-old who has decided a topic is interesting, whether she will get to wear a truly grand gown someday, one with the wide hoops she has seen on older women at court occasions, and Isabelle tells her yes, someday, not too far off now, and watches her daughter's face light with an anticipation that Isabelle remembers feeling herself, once, a very long time ago, before she understood quite how heavy a grand gown could actually feel by the end of a long evening. There is a particular fan resting in a drawer of Isabelle's dressing table that deserves its own moment, because objects like it carry a kind of history that never appears in any official record of the family. It was a gift from Etienne's mother, the Dowager Marquise, given to Isabelle on the morning of her wedding, painted with a small pastoral scene, shepherdesses beneath a stand of trees, the kind of image fashionable a generation earlier and already slightly out of style by the time it was given. Isabelle understood, even at 19, that the fan was not simply a gift. It was a message, a subtle assertion of the older woman's continued relevance within a household she was formally, ceremonially, handing over to her son's new wife. The dowager still lives, in fact, in a smaller apartment 1 floor below, and the relationship between the two women, mother and daughter-in-law, has settled over 11 years into something Isabelle would describe, if pressed, as careful rather than warm. The dowager visits perhaps twice a week, always announced, never spontaneous, and today happens to be one of those days. She arrives just as the early evening light has begun to soften toward violet outside the windows, moving through the apartment with the particular slow authority of a woman who ran this household for 3 decades before ceding it, reluctantly, to someone else. She has opinions, freely offered, about nearly everything: the arrangement of the sitting room furniture, which she considers subtly wrong, the children's education, which she finds insufficiently rigorous, the state of Etienne's health, which she worries over with a persistence that Isabelle finds simultaneously touching and faintly exhausting. Isabelle has learned, across more than a decade, precisely how to manage these visits, when to agree readily, when to redirect gently, when to simply let a comment pass unanswered and allow it to dissolve on its own. It is a particular kind of diplomacy that nobody teaches formally, and every young bride at Versailles is expected to master within her first year of marriage, or risk years of quiet domestic friction. Tonight the visit passes smoothly enough, the dowager admiring Marguerite's dancing progress, expressing gentle disapproval of Julian's continued resistance to his Latin, and departing before the family's own dinner, as she always does, having never once in 11 years stayed to share an actual meal with her son's household. Isabelle has stopped wondering why. Some family patterns simply exist without explanation, inherited rather than chosen, and this is one of them. Dinner itself tonight is a quieter affair than the midday meal, a private family dinner without the shared hosting arrangement of the afternoon, just the two of them, since the children eat separately in the nursery at this hour. It is in some ways the most honest meal of Isabelle's day, the one stretch of eating that happens without an audience beyond her own husband, and she allows herself here a genuine appetite that the public meal never permits. The conversation drifts easily between them, the day's various small dramas, the appointment lost to the Montclair family, a piece of gossip Isabelle picked up from Adelaide that morning, softened slightly in the retelling out of a lingering discretion she cannot quite abandon even in private. Etienne mentions, partway through the meal, that he has been thinking of writing to a distant cousin with connections at the ministry, a possible avenue toward the kind of appointment that slipped past them today, and Isabelle listens, offering the occasional careful suggestion, aware that this quiet strategizing over a private dinner table is, itself, another form of the labor that fills nearly every hour of their lives here, even the hours meant for rest. There is no truly separate category of leisure at Versailles, not for a family positioned the way theirs is. Even affection, even genuine partnership between husband and wife, operates in service of the larger project of the family's continued relevance, and Isabelle has made a kind of peace with that fact that she could not have imagined making at 19, arriving here with entirely different, softer expectations of what married life might feel like. And yet there is real warmth in this particular hour too, genuine rather than performed, and that thread should not get lost entirely beneath all the strategy. Etienne reaches across the table at one point, an unremarkable gesture, simply resting his hand briefly over hers as he makes a point about the letter he intends to write, and the touch carries none of the calculation that governs so much of their public life together. 11 years is a long time to build a marriage inside a building this demanding, and whatever else has been shaped and compromised by the particular pressures of this place, something real has also grown here, quietly, in the gaps between all the performance, and Isabelle finds herself, in this ordinary, unremarkable moment over an unremarkable dinner, genuinely glad of it. The evening winds down gradually after that, the household settling into its late hours with the same unhurried rhythm that governs the whole day. A short visit to the family chapel before full dark, a small private space just off the main apartment, where the household gathers most evenings for a brief prayer. More habit than fervour for most of them, though Isabelle finds a certain real comfort in the ritual regardless, the familiar words, the small flickering votive candles, a few minutes of stillness that ask nothing performative of her at all. Marguerite fidgets through most of it, as 9-year-olds do. Julien, exhausted from his day, nearly falls asleep standing up, and Etienne catches him gently by the shoulder before he can stumble, a small unremarkable act of fatherly care that nobody in the room comments on because nobody needs to. Once the children are settled for the night and the chapel candles extinguished, the apartment enters its final, quietest phase, the hour or two before the household itself goes fully to sleep. Isabelle retreats to a small private sitting room adjoining her bedchamber, a space she thinks of, privately, as the one room in the apartment that belongs entirely to her, and here she does what she does most nights at this hour, works a little at embroidery, not out of any real passion for the craft, but because the repetitive motion of it settles her mind in a way little else does after a day this thoroughly performed. Tonight's piece is a small cushion cover, a pattern of vines and small flowers she has been slowly working for months, in no particular hurry to finish it. There is a particular quality to this hour that Isabelle has come to treasure precisely because so little of her day allows for anything like it, an hour with no audience at all, not even Claudine, who has been dismissed for the night, not even Etienne, occupied in his own study with correspondence, just Isabelle, a needle moving slowly through fabric by candlelight, the sounds of the palace settling gradually into its nighttime murmur beyond the window, and for this small stretch of time nothing at all is required of her except to simply exist in the quiet. Let me take you somewhere else within this same home now, somewhere smaller, somewhere the family themselves rarely think much about, because every apartment at Versailles depends entirely on a service passage running behind it, a narrow, unadorned corridor that the Beaumonts themselves almost never set foot in, but that carries the true daily machinery of the household. Behind the papered walls and gilt mirrors of the family's rooms runs this second, invisible version of the apartment, barely wide enough for 2 people to pass, lit by tallow candles far cheaper than the wax ones burning in the rooms just beyond the wall, and it is through this passage that nearly everything actually happens. Meals arrive through it, carried up narrow back stairs from a shared kitchen 2 floors below that serves several households at once. Chamber pots depart through it. Firewood, linen, letters, all of it moves along this hidden spine of the building, and the family experiences almost none of the labour directly, only its finished result, arriving as if by quiet magic through a door that always seems to open at precisely the right moment. Claudine and Perrine both sleep in a small room off this passage, a space perhaps 1/10 the size of Isabelle's own bedchamber, shared between them, with a single narrow window that looks out not onto the gardens but onto an interior light well, grey and dim even at midday. It would be easy, and not entirely wrong, to describe the gap between this room and the Beaumont family's own chambers as the whole story of noble life at Versailles condensed into a single wall, luxury on one side, labour on the other, separated by boards thin enough that Claudine can hear, faintly, most nights, the low murmur of Isabelle and Etienne's conversation drifting through, though she has long since trained herself not to listen closely, a small daily discipline of discretion that nobody ever formally asked of her, and that she practices anyway, because a lady's maid who cannot be trusted with the sounds of a household's private life does not remain a lady's maid for long. Claudine has served Isabelle for 14 years now, since before the marriage, and there is a genuine complicated intimacy between them that neither would quite describe using that word, because the gap in their stations makes the word feel wrong even when the underlying feeling is real enough. Claudine knows things about Isabelle that Etienne does not, small daily details, which mornings the Marquise wakes already tired before a single word has been spoken, which pieces of news from home in Burgundy still, after all these years, bring a shadow across her face for an hour or two afterward. Isabelle, in turn, knows a good deal about Claudine's own life, a brother back in the countryside she sends money to quietly each quarter. A hope, never quite voiced directly but understood between them anyway, that Claudine might one day marry a footman from a neighbouring household, a match that would require Isabelle's blessing and, more practically, her willingness to help negotiate the small financial arrangements that any marriage among servants at Versailles requires. This is a texture of life here that tends to get lost in grander accounts of Versailles, the way genuine affection and rigid hierarchy exist simultaneously, without cancelling each other out, in nearly every relationship in a household like this one. Claudine would never presume to sit at Isabelle's table. Isabelle would never presume that Claudine's 14 years of loyal, skilled, honestly important service should go unnoticed or unrewarded. Both things are true at once, held in a kind of steady balance that the whole building seems to run on, master and servant bound together by obligations that flow in both directions, however unequal the terms. The kitchen itself, 2 floors below, deserves a moment too, because it is one of the loudest, hottest, most physically demanding spaces in this entire quiet, elegant building, and it never fully stops. Fires burn there from before dawn until well past the family's own bedtime, tended by a rotating staff of cooks and undercooks who prepare, across a single day, food for the several households sharing this particular kitchen's resources, coordinating an almost impossibly complex schedule of courses and timing, so that 9 dishes can arrive at the Beaumont table in the correct sequence, each one still properly hot, despite the journey up 2 flights of narrow stairs and along that same hidden passage behind the walls. The head cook for this particular kitchen, a broad, perpetually sweating man named Fournier, has held his post for over 20 years and possesses, in his own domain, a kind of authority that would be unthinkable for a man of his station anywhere else in the building. Even Etienne, on the rare occasion he ventures down to discuss a menu for some particularly important dinner, treats Fournier with a careful deference that has nothing to do with rank and everything to do with simple practical respect for a man who can, with a single quiet word to his staff, make or ruin an evening that matters enormously to the family upstairs. Seasons move differently through a building like this than they do through an ordinary house, a fact worth pausing on, because the palace's sheer scale changes how weather actually reaches the people living inside it. Autumn, arriving now across the gardens beyond Isabelle's window, means something specific here, a shift in which fireplaces get lit first each morning, a change in the household's daily bread from the lighter summer loaves to something heavier and more filling, an entire seasonal adjustment to the wardrobe that Claudine and Perrine will spend the better part of a week managing, airing out heavier fabrics that have sat folded in cedar since spring, checking for moths, for the particular musty smell that wool develops after months in storage. Isabelle notices the season most clearly in the mornings now, the particular chill that has crept into the apartment overnight despite the banked coals, a chill that will deepen considerably by the time true winter arrives, when even a building as grand as this one struggles, in its farthest rooms, to keep entirely warm. There was a winter 3 years ago now, when the cold grew severe enough that wine reportedly froze in glasses at the king's own table in another part of the palace, a detail that travelled through the household gossip network within days and that Isabelle still remembers vividly, mostly because of how strange it felt that a building this enormous, this impossibly grand, could still be defeated by something as simple as weather. Versailles projects an image of complete mastery over nature, over fashion, over the entire visible world, and then winter arrives regardless, indifferent to all of it, finding its way through window seams and beneath doors no matter how many tapestries get hung against the cold. And there is something Isabelle finds almost comforting in that particular limitation, proof that even this place, for all its performance of total control, remains subject to the same basic forces as everywhere else. There is a grand evening approaching on the household's calendar, a formal ball to be held in a fortnight, to mark a minor royal anniversary, and preparation for an occasion like this begins far earlier than most people would guess, weeks rather than days, and it touches nearly every corner of the apartment once it begins in earnest. Isabelle's gown for the evening is already underway, commissioned from a dressmaker in Paris, whose workshop Isabelle has patronized for nearly a decade, a woman named Madame Lefebvre, who has, over the years, come to understand Isabelle's particular preferences well enough that the two of them communicate now in a kind of shorthand, a few sketched lines and a swatch of fabric sufficient to convey an entire vision. The gown itself, when a length of the chosen silk arrives at the apartment for Isabelle's approval, is a deep blue verging on violet in certain light, embroidered along the bodice with a pattern of small silver leaves that will, Madame Lefebvre has promised, catch candlelight beautifully across a crowded ballroom. The fabric alone represents a sum that would support a tradesman's family in Paris for the better part of a year, and Isabelle handles it now with the particular unthinking ease of someone who has simply never had to weigh that comparison directly, though she is not entirely oblivious to it either. She thinks of it sometimes, briefly, the way she thought of it just now, running the silk between her fingers, and then, as always, the thought passes without resolving into anything like guilt or particular reflection. This is simply the shape of the world she was born into, and questioning its foundations too deeply has never seemed, to her, like a productive use of the limited hours in any given day. A gown like this carries an enormous quantity of underlying structure that never actually shows in the finished garment, and understanding it explains a great deal about why noblewomen of this era move the way they do, with that particular careful, upright grace that period paintings capture so consistently. Beneath the visible silk will sit a boned stay, tightly laced, shaping Isabelle's torso into the fashionable conical silhouette, and beneath that, wide panniers, a structure of whalebone or light wood that will extend her hips dramatically outward on either side, wide enough that she will need to turn sideways to pass through certain doorways in the palace, a genuine, well-documented inconvenience of the fashion that every noblewoman here has simply learnt to work around without complaint, the same way one learns to work around any other permanent feature of the built environment. Isabelle remembers, with real clarity, the first time she wore panniers of this width, at 17, still unmarried, attending her very first formal court function with her mother beside her, and the sheer disorientation of the experience, misjudging distances constantly, catching the wide framework on furniture, on other women's equally wide skirts, the particular controlled panic of trying to curtsy correctly while managing a garment that seemed to have a will entirely its own. She has long since mastered it, the way one masters any difficult skill through sheer repetition, and now moves through even the most crowded ballroom with a practiced ease that looks from the outside entirely effortless, which is of course precisely the point. There is a particular kind of vulnerability tucked inside all this elaborate preparation that Isabelle rarely allows herself to examine too closely, though it surfaces now, briefly, as she stands for a fitting a week before the ball, Madame Lefebvre's assistant pinning the half-finished bodice into place around her. She will be 40 in 3 years. It is not an old age, not by any real measure, and yet she has begun to notice, in these fittings, small changes that were not present a decade ago, the particular way certain necklines now require slightly more careful consideration than they once did, the faint lines beginning to settle around her eyes that no quantity of the fashionable creams and preparations Claudine helps her apply each morning can fully erase. Fashion at court does not forgive age gracefully. A woman's currency here, however actually respected she may be for her wit or her connections or her management of a household, still depends in real part on a kind of visual performance that grows quietly, relentlessly harder to sustain with each passing year, and Isabelle feels this now, standing in front of the mirror in her half-finished gown, a small cold thread of worry she has never spoken aloud to anyone, not Etienne, not Claudine, not even, in any real detail, to herself. She sets the thought aside, the way she sets aside most things that feel too large to examine directly during an ordinary afternoon fitting, and turns her attention instead to the practical matter of jewellery, a much easier problem to solve. The Beaumont family owns a modest but respectable collection, inherited mostly through Etienne's mother's side, and Isabelle has already decided on a necklace of small sapphires that will complement the gown's deep blue without competing with it, a choice that required, in its own quiet way, nearly as much careful calculation as anything else about the evening's presentation. Jewellery at a function like this communicates almost as much as the gown itself, a visible, unmistakable signal of the family's continued financial health, and Isabelle is aware, choosing these particular sapphires over a larger, more ostentatious set that also sits in the family's collection, that she is making a deliberate statement of restraint rather than excess, a calculated modesty that she hopes will read as confidence rather than, as it might in a less secure family, as an inability to display more. The ball itself, when the evening finally arrives, unfolds across several hours in one of the palace's grand reception rooms, and describing it honestly matters, because the reality diverges in interesting ways from how these evenings tend to get imagined. It is loud, first of all, far louder than the hushed, elegant image most people carry. Hundreds of voices layered over music from an orchestra positioned at one end of the room, the particular percussive clatter of countless heeled shoes against parquet flooring, a constant low roar punctuated by laughter, by the occasional raised voice, by the general chaos of several hundred people occupying a single enormous space at once. It is hot, too, despite the season, hundreds of candles and hundreds of bodies raising the room's temperature noticeably within the first hour, so that by midnight most of the guests, however composed they appear, are quietly, uncomfortably warm beneath their heavy formal clothing. Isabelle dances twice with Etienne across the evening, the formal, structured steps of the current fashionable dances, requiring a level of concentration that leaves little room for actual conversation, and she spends a good deal of the remaining hours doing what most women at a function like this spend their evening doing, standing, watching, exchanging brief conversations, managing the endless small social calculations of who to approach, who to avoid, how long to linger near any particular conversation before it starts to look like something other than casual proximity. There is real pleasure in parts of it, unmistakably, the music, the sheer visual spectacle of hundreds of gowns and candles and mirrors, multiplying the light endlessly across the room's reflective walls. A beauty that Isabelle, even after 11 years of these evenings, has never entirely stopped noticing. And there is real exhaustion in it too, the particular bone-deep tiredness that comes from hours of sustained performance, smiling correctly, standing correctly, saying the correct small things to the correct small number of people, a tiredness that has nothing to do with the dancing itself, and everything to do with the unbroken vigilance the whole evening demands. By the time the family's carriage, or rather the short walk back through connecting corridors, since the ballroom sits close enough to their own apartment that no actual carriage is required tonight, returns Isabelle and Etienne to their own rooms, it is well past 2 in the morning, and the apartment feels almost startlingly quiet after the roar of the evening, a silence so complete it takes Isabelle several minutes to stop hearing, faintly, the ghost of the orchestra still playing somewhere behind her ears. Claudine is waiting, of course, despite the hour, and the unlacing begins again. The same practiced motions as any other night, though slower now, both women tired in the particular way that only a long formal evening produces, a tiredness located as much in the face and the eyes as in the body itself. Etienne appears in the doorway between their rooms once Bertrand has finished with him, still half-dressed, his formal coat already gone, and there is a particular softness to him at this hour that the day's version of him rarely shows, the performance mostly stripped away by sheer exhaustion. He mentions quietly that he managed a brief but promising conversation with the minister whose favour might yet help secure a position for the family, a small piece of good news tucked into the evening's general blur, and Isabelle feels a genuine warmth at hearing it, setting aside for now the small cold worry about age and gowns and diminishing currency that surfaced earlier in the week. There will be time for that worry again, there always is. Tonight, this piece of good news is enough. Once Claudine has finally gone, and the candles have been reduced to the single one Isabelle keeps burning until she is ready to sleep, she sits for a moment at the edge of her bed, not yet lying down, simply existing in the particular stillness of a grand evening finally concluded. There is a specific quality to this hour that she has come to recognize across 11 years of these balls, a kind of quiet deflation, not unhappy exactly, just the natural settling that follows any period of sustained performance, the body and mind both slowly remembering that nothing more is required of them until morning. Outside her window, the gardens lie in complete darkness now, the elaborate parterres invisible, the fountains silent, since they only run during the day and on the grandest of occasions, conserving the enormous quantity of water their operation requires. Somewhere far off, she can hear the faint sound of other guests still making their way home through the palace's endless corridors, laughter carrying strangely through the stone and plaster, distorted by distance into something almost dreamlike. This is the sound Versailles makes at its quietest, not true silence, never quite that, but something close to it, the enormous machinery of the place idling rather than fully stopped, ready to begin again within a handful of hours. Let me tell you about a different kind of day now, one further back in the family's recent history, because it says something important about who these people actually are beneath all the performance. 2 winters ago, a heavy snow kept the entire court largely confined indoors for the better part of a week, the gardens buried, the usual outdoor promenades and garden appointments simply cancelled, and something curious happened during that stretch of enforced stillness. The rigid daily schedule that normally governs every hour at Versailles loosened just slightly, and the Beaumont household found itself with actual unstructured time, an experience rare enough that nobody in the family quite knew what to do with it at first. Etienne, of all people, proposed that they spend an afternoon simply together, all 4 of them, in the main sitting room, with no visitors expected and no obligations pressing. Isabelle remembers it with unusual clarity even now. A fire built up larger than usual against the cold, Marguerite and Julien both allowed to abandon their lessons for the day, an afternoon spent playing a simple card game that Etienne had learnt as a boy, one that required no particular skill, only luck, so that even 6-year-old Julien could win a round now and then, which he did, twice, with an expression of such pure, uncomplicated delight that both his parents found themselves laughing harder than the moment strictly warranted. There was no audience for that afternoon, no servant beyond the one tending the fire, dismissed once the wood was properly stacked, no calculation, no positioning, no careful management of appearance, just a family, briefly, entirely for its own sake, and Isabelle has held on to the memory of it since with a tenderness that surprises her sometimes, given how small and unremarkable the actual events of the afternoon were, a card game, a fire, 2 children's laughter. She has come to understand in the years since that this is precisely what made it valuable, the total absence of anything performed, a rarity so complete in a life like hers that even a single afternoon of it becomes worth remembering in detail years later. Etienne has a younger brother, a man named Philippe, who chose a different path entirely, one that the family discusses only carefully in measured tones when the subject arises at all. Philippe left Versailles a decade ago, gave up his own small allotted position at court, and now lives on a modest property near Rouen, managing land, raising a family of his own in circumstances that would have seemed, to their parents' generation, like a significant step downward. Isabelle has always privately admired the choice more than she has ever said aloud, aware that voicing such admiration too openly would complicate her own family's careful positioning within the court hierarchy that Philippe walked away from. Philippe visits perhaps once a year, and his presence in the apartment always produces a curious, faintly destabilizing effect. A person who has plainly, completely opted out of the entire elaborate performance that structures every one of the Beaumont family's days, and who seems, by every observable measure, considerably happier for it. He laughs more easily than Etienne does. He speaks more plainly, without the careful calculation that governs nearly every sentence spoken within these walls. Isabelle finds herself, during his visits, watching her husband watch his brother and wondering what particular private calculations move behind Etienne's own carefully composed face during those brief windows each year when an alternative version of his life sits across the dinner table from him, entirely real, entirely available, and entirely refused. There is a clock in the main sitting room of the Beaumont apartment that deserves its own small story, a gilt bronze piece that sits on the mantel and has, for as long as Isabelle has lived in this apartment, run consistently 4 minutes fast. Etienne has had it examined twice by a clockmaker summoned specifically for the purpose, and both times the man declared the mechanism sound, adjusted it carefully, and both times, within a matter of weeks, it drifted back to precisely the same 4 minutes ahead of every other clock in the apartment. Isabelle has stopped trying to correct it. She has come instead to rely on it in a strange, backward way, using its particular fastness as a kind of private buffer against the constant risk of arriving anywhere even a moment late, a risk that carries real social weight in a building where punctuality signals respect and its absence signals something considerably less flattering. She thinks of the clock now as something almost like a slightly eccentric member of the household, stubborn in its own small mechanical way, and she would be truly sorry to see it finally corrected. Bathing, as a subject, tends to surprise people learning about this period for the first time, because the reality diverges sharply from certain popular assumptions about how infrequently people of this era washed. Isabelle bathes with real regularity, though the process looks nothing like a modern bath. No dedicated bathing room, no running water, simply a large copper tub carried into her bedchamber and filled laboriously by servants hauling heated water up from the kitchens below, a task substantial enough that a full bath happens perhaps once or twice a week rather than daily. Between full baths, daily washing relies heavily on linen cloths and basins of water, a careful, thorough process focused especially on the parts of the body visible in fashionable dress, the face, the hands, the neck, while the fuller washing waits for the more elaborate occasion of an actual bath. Perfume, as mentioned before, does a great deal of the remaining work, but it would be wrong to imagine the nobility of Versailles as uniformly unwashed in the way certain popular myths suggest. Cleanliness carries real social value here, understood somewhat differently than in later centuries, but taken seriously nonetheless, and Isabelle would find the suggestion that she neglects her own basic hygiene faintly insulting were anyone ever crass enough to suggest it directly, which, naturally, nobody ever would. Letters occupy an enormous amount of the household's daily rhythm, more than most modern accounts of the period tend to emphasize, and Isabelle spends a portion of nearly every day either reading or composing correspondence, a practice that connects the apartment to a whole invisible web of relationships stretching far beyond the palace walls. Her mother in Burgundy, the cousin in Lyon, Philippe's wife near Rouen, various friends scattered across other noble households throughout France, all of it maintained through a steady stream of letters carried by courier, arriving and departing on a schedule Isabelle has long since internalized without needing to think about it consciously. There is a particular letter, kept in a small locked drawer of her writing desk, that Isabelle rereads perhaps twice a year, always alone, always late at night. It is from her father, written shortly before his death when Isabelle was newly pregnant with Marguerite, and it says very little of any practical consequence, mostly small observations about the weather in Burgundy, that autumn, a mention of a horse he had recently acquired, ordinary, unremarkable content that would mean nothing to anyone else who might happen to read it. Isabelle keeps it anyway, has kept it for a decade now, because it is in its complete ordinariness the last thing her father ever wrote to her before a sudden illness took him within the space of a fortnight, and there is something in its very lack of significance that she finds she cannot quite let go of. He did not know, writing about his horse and the weather, that he was writing the last words she would ever receive from him. Neither did she, reading it. That gap between the letter's small, unimportant content and the enormous weight it carries now is a thing Isabelle has never fully found language for, not even in the privacy of her own thoughts, and she does not try tonight either, simply holding the folded paper for a moment before returning it carefully to its drawer. Health and illness move through this household the way they move through every household of this era, unpredictably, without warning, and the family has developed its own particular set of quiet rituals around it, small precautions, small superstitions inherited from Isabelle's own mother that nobody examines too closely for whether they actually work, a particular herbal preparation kept always on hand for the children's minor complaints, a doctor summoned promptly and without hesitation at the first sign of anything beyond the most ordinary childhood cold, a level of medical attention available to this family that most people in France at this period could never dream of accessing, even as it remains, by later standards, remarkably limited in what it can actually accomplish. Isabelle does not dwell on this gap. Nobody in her position does. Not really. It exists quietly beneath the surface of daily life, an awareness held lightly rather than confronted directly, the same way most people hold the knowledge of their own mortality, present but rarely examined head-on. There is a particular rainy afternoon, more recent than the snowbound week 2 winters back, that Isabelle finds herself thinking of now, settled again in her private sitting room with her embroidery, because it offers a useful contrast to the grandeur of the ball just past. Rain at Versailles, unlike snow, does not halt the schedule at all. Court obligations continue regardless, courtiers moving through corridors rather than gardens, the elaborate outdoor promenades simply relocated indoors without any formal acknowledgement that the weather has changed anything at all. But within the privacy of her own apartment, on a heavily rainy afternoon a few months back, Isabelle found herself with an unexpected hour free between obligations, and she spent it, unusually, simply sitting by the window, watching water run down the glass, tracing the small rivulets with her eyes the way she imagines Marguerite might, a kind of watching with no purpose at all beyond the watching itself. It occurred to her then, and it occurs to her again now, remembering it, that these small unstructured pockets of time have become almost precious to her precisely because they are so rare, more precious, in their own quiet way, than the grand ball just concluded, more precious than the sapphires or the silk gown or the careful social choreography of the Hall of Mirrors. There is a version of contentment available in this life that has nothing to do with any of the performance, and Isabelle has learnt, slowly, across 11 years, to recognize it when it appears, and to hold on to it a little more deliberately than she once did, back when she was younger and still mistook all the glitter for the substance underneath it. Let me go back further, to the very beginning of this particular marriage, because it explains a good deal about the quiet, steady partnership that has grown between Isabelle and Etienne across these 11 years, and it did not begin the way romantic stories usually claim these things begin. Isabelle met her husband for the first time only 6 weeks before their wedding, a match arranged between their two families through the careful negotiation of lawyers and parents, the kind of arrangement entirely ordinary for people of their station and entirely unremarkable to everyone involved except, perhaps, the two young people actually required to build an entire shared life on top of it. She remembers that first meeting with unusual clarity even now, a formal visit at her father's house in Burgundy, Etienne arriving with his own parents, all of them seated stiffly in her father's best sitting room, while the two families exchanged the kind of careful, weighted small talk that such occasions demand. Etienne was 23 then, 3 years older than Isabelle, and she remembers being struck, not by any particular handsomeness, though he was pleasant enough to look at, but by a certain quality of attention he paid her during that first stilted conversation, a genuine curiosity about her opinions on a book she happened to mention, rather than the polite, empty interest she had half expected from a young man, more concerned with the size of her dowry than the contents of her mind. Their wedding, 6 weeks later, was a substantial affair, conducted in Burgundy at her family's estate before the couple travelled to Versailles to begin their married life properly within the palace's apartments that Etienne's family had held for 2 generations already. Isabelle remembers almost nothing of the ceremony itself with any real clarity. A blur of ritual and formal clothing, and her own considerable nervousness, but she remembers vividly the carriage ride afterward, the two of them alone together for the first truly private conversation of their entire brief courtship, and how Etienne, rather than filling the silence with the kind of confident performance she had expected from a young nobleman of his position, admitted instead that he was nearly as nervous as she was, that he hoped quite plainly that they might come to actually like each other in time, not simply manage each other's expectations for the rest of their lives. It was a small admission, and an unusual one for a man of his upbringing to make so openly, and Isabelle has held on to it across the 11 years since as a kind of quiet foundation stone beneath everything that followed, all the performance and calculation and careful management of appearances that would come to fill so much of their daily life together. Beneath all of it, there has always been that first honest sentence in a swaying carriage, two frightened young people admitting, quietly, that they hoped for something real together and choosing, in ways large and small, across more than a decade since, to keep building toward it. The early months of the marriage were not easy, and Isabelle does not romanticize them in memory the way she sometimes catches herself romanticizing that first carriage ride. She arrived at Versailles knowing almost no one, thrust immediately into a social world with rules so intricate and so entirely unlike anything her more modest upbringing in Burgundy had prepared her for, that she spent the better part of her first year in a state of near-constant low-grade anxiety, terrified of some small misstep, some incorrect curtsy or misjudged comment that might permanently damage her new family's standing before she had even fully learnt the shape of the world she had married into. The dowager, Etienne's mother, was of little help during those early months, offering criticism far more readily than guidance, correcting Isabelle's posture or her choice of words with a briskness that felt at the time considerably crueler than the older woman likely intended. It was Adelaide, the same widowed comtesse who visited just this week with her blunt account of court gossip, who took a genuine, patient interest in the frightened young bride during that first difficult year, walking her through the palace's unwritten rules with a kindness that Isabelle has never forgotten and has tried, in her own quieter way, to extend to other young women arriving at court in the years since. This is a thread running underneath the more visible competition and calculation of court friendship, easy to miss if you only look at the surface, a genuine tradition of older women taking younger ones under their care, passing down the accumulated knowledge of how to survive and even, eventually, thrive within a world this demanding. By the time Marguerite was born, 3 years into the marriage, Isabelle had largely found her footing, had learnt the rules well enough to move through them without the constant anxious vigilance of those first months. Though the vigilance never fully disappeared, simply became quieter, more automatic, woven into the fabric of how she moves through every day now, rather than sitting at the front of her mind the way it once did. Marguerite's birth itself was attended by a physician and 2 midwives, a labour that lasted the better part of a full day and night, and Isabelle remembers, even now, the particular terror of it, a fear that nobody discusses openly among noble women, despite how universally it seems to be felt, the very real danger that childbirth carried at this period for women of every station, noble or otherwise. She survived it, obviously, and Marguerite arrived healthy and loud, and Isabelle remembers the specific, overwhelming relief of that first cry more clearly than she remembers almost anything else from those early years of marriage, a relief so total it left her briefly unable to speak, tears running freely down her face in a rare public moment entirely unguarded by any of the usual performance. Etienne, waiting in the room just beyond, wept too when told, a fact Isabelle only learnt second-hand from Claudine, since custom kept him from the birthing room itself, and she has treasured that second-hand knowledge ever since, the image of her careful, composed husband briefly, completely undone by relief and joy, in a room she never actually saw. Julian's birth, 3 years after that, carried its own particular fear, sharper in some ways than the first, because Isabelle now understood exactly what could go wrong, having heard, in the years between her 2 children's births, of at least 2 other noble women at court who had not survived their own labours. She does not dwell on this often. It sits, like so much else in her life, in that quiet interior place reserved for things too large to examine directly during an ordinary day, surfacing occasionally, as it does now, remembering, and then receding again beneath the more immediate business of a life that, in the end, continued, healthy and largely fortunate, in ways she has never once taken entirely for granted. Winter proper arrives within the month following the ball, and with it comes an entirely different rhythm to the household's days, one built around the particular customs that gather each year toward the end of December. The palace itself transforms in ways both practical and ceremonial. Additional fires are lit in corridors rarely heated during warmer months, and the household's own wood supply, managed carefully by a steward who answers directly to Etienne, requires constant replenishing, delivered by the same carts whose wheels on gravel Isabelle hears most nights through her cracked window. There is a particular smell that settles over the whole apartment during these coldest weeks. Wood smoke layered over the usual powder and beeswax, a smell Isabelle has come to associate so completely with this season that catching it unexpectedly, even years later in some other context entirely, she suspects would return her instantly to exactly this stretch of her life. The approach of the new year brings a formal court ceremony that the whole family attends, a lengthy religious observance followed by an exchange of gifts among the assembled nobility, conducted with the same careful choreography that governs nearly every public occasion here. Isabelle has prepared small gifts for perhaps a dozen people this year, each one chosen with real thought given to the particular relationship it represents. A fine pair of embroidered gloves for Celeste, whose friendship, whatever its underlying currents, Isabelle really values. A small devotional book for the dowager, chosen specifically because Isabelle knows her mother-in-law's particular taste in such things, after 11 years of careful observation. A handsome pen case for Etienne himself, practical and well-made, the kind of gift that says, without saying it directly, that she has noticed how much correspondence fills his days and wanted to make some small part of it more pleasant. Etienne's own preparations mirror hers in scope if not in specific content, and there is a particular scene that plays out most years around this season, the two of them comparing gift lists over a late evening in Isabelle's private sitting room, checking for overlaps, for oversights, for anyone whose omission might cause offense in a social world where such omissions are noticed and remembered far longer than either of them would prefer. This year, Isabelle catches one such oversight, a cousin of Etienne's whose recent minor court appointment means his standing has shifted just enough that a gift previously unnecessary has now become quietly obligatory, and Etienne, sincerely grateful for the catch, remarks that he does not know what he would do without her particular memory for exactly this kind of shifting social arithmetic. It is a small compliment, offered lightly, and Isabelle finds herself, hearing it, feeling a small private pride that has nothing to do with any gown or jewel, the simple satisfaction of being deeply useful to a partnership she has spent 11 years helping to build. There is a hunting expedition that Etienne joins most winters, one of the few occasions when the household's rhythm shifts to accommodate an activity built around Etienne's interests rather than the shared social calendar of the family as a whole, and this year's hunt, held on a crisp, clear morning in a section of forest attached to the palace grounds, sends him off before dawn with a small party of other noblemen, dressed in heavy wool rather than his usual formal coats, a version of her husband that Isabelle rarely sees, more physical, more visibly at ease in his own body than the careful, composed man who moves through the Hall of Mirrors each afternoon. He returns by early afternoon, cold and plainly happy, recounting the details of the hunt with an animation that reminds Isabelle, briefly, of the young man in that first swaying carriage all those years ago, before 11 years of careful court performance had settled so thoroughly into his usual bearing. There is something Isabelle finds quietly moving about these occasional glimpses of an Etienne unburdened by the constant vigilance that governs nearly everything else, and she finds herself wishing, not for the first time, that more of their shared life might look like this particular afternoon, unhurried, genuinely warm, entirely free of calculation. The children too experience this season differently than the rest of the year, and Marguerite in particular has begun asking, with increasing frequency, when she might attend her first proper court function, a milestone still officially 2 years off, but one she has clearly been anticipating, with the specific intensity that only a child on the edge of some long-awaited transition can muster. Isabelle handles these questions with a patience she does not always feel, aware that her daughter's eagerness carries within it an innocence about what such attendance will actually require, the years of careful preparation still ahead of her, the elaborate dance instruction, the deportment lessons, the slow, deliberate education in exactly the kind of vigilant self-presentation that Isabelle herself learnt the hard way, through trial and error and the occasional painful correction from a mother-in-law, with little patience for a young bride's mistakes. She finds herself wondering, watching Marguerite practice a curtsy unprompted one evening in the sitting room, whether she ought to try to prepare her daughter differently than she herself was prepared, whether there is some way to pass along the necessary skills without also passing along quite so much of the underlying anxiety that still, even now, occasionally surfaces in Isabelle's own chest, before some particularly important social occasion, she does not yet know the answer. It is one of the quieter, more persistent questions she carries through these winter days, turning it over without urgency, the way one turns over any question that does not require an immediate resolution, content to simply let it sit and develop slowly across the months and years still ahead. Julian, meanwhile, remains blessedly unconcerned with any of this, still young enough that his days revolve around considerably simpler pleasures, a particular wooden horse he has become fiercely attached to, a game he has invented involving an elaborate imaginary battle fought across the pattern of the sitting room carpet, using small carved figures that Etienne brought back for him from a trip to Paris the previous spring. Isabelle watches him some evenings with a specific tenderness she recognizes as different from what she feels watching Marguerite, not more or less, simply different, shaped by his particular temperament, his fearless, unfiltered honesty, his apparent immunity, so far, to the careful self-consciousness that has already begun settling over his older sister. There is a particular evening, late in this same winter, when both children are allowed, as a special treat, to stay up later than usual and join their parents for a portion of the evening in the main sitting room. The fire built up large, the household's usual formal rhythm suspended for a few hours in favor of something considerably more relaxed. Etienne tells the children a story, an old family tale about a distant ancestor who supposedly outwitted a particularly troublesome neighboring lord through nothing more than clever wordplay, a story Isabelle suspects has grown considerably more elaborate, with each retelling across several generations, and Marguerite and Julien both listen with the rapt, uncomplicated attention that children reserve for exactly this kind of storytelling. Firelight moving across their faces, the whole scene carrying a warmth that has nothing to do with any of the elaborate performance filling the rest of their days. One particular ceremony at Versailles the Beaumont family has, on rare occasions, the privilege of witnessing directly a formal royal rising each morning, known among the court as the levee, and describing it matters because it captures something essential about how thoroughly ceremony saturates even the most basic human activities within this building. The king's own waking and dressing, ordinary in any other household, unfolds here as an elaborate public ritual attended by a carefully ranked selection of courtiers, each permitted entry at a different stage of the process depending on their precise standing, some allowed in only for the earliest, most intimate moment of waking, others admitted later, once the more formal stages of dressing have already begun. Etienne has attended the levee perhaps a dozen times across his years at court, each invitation a small, carefully noted marker of the family's continued relevance, and he described it to Isabelle once, early in their marriage, with a kind of bemused wonder that has never entirely faded even after repeated exposure, the strange spectacle of watching a grown man handed his shirt by one attendant, his stockings by another, each garment passed through a precise sequence of hands according to rules so old and so specific that nobody currently living entirely remembers their original purpose, only that the sequence must be followed exactly, every single morning, without variation. Isabelle herself has never attended, since the levee remains, by long custom, a largely male occasion, but she has heard enough detailed accounts from Etienne and others to have formed a vivid picture of it in her mind, the particular hush that falls over the assembled courtiers at the precise moment the king first opens his eyes, the careful graduated procession of attendants entering and departing according to rank, the whole elaborate performance existing, at bottom, to accomplish nothing more than getting one man dressed for the day, a task that in the Beaumont household itself, considerably more modest by comparison, requires perhaps 2 servants and 20 unhurried minutes. This gap between the actual practical requirements of dressing and the towering ceremonial edifice built up around the king's version of it says something important about the whole logic of Versailles that Isabelle has come to understand more fully with each passing year. Ceremony here does not exist to accomplish practical goals efficiently. It exists to make visible, in the most literal sense, the precise gradations of a hierarchy that would otherwise remain invisible, abstract, difficult to feel in any immediate way. Watching a courtier permitted entry to the king's bedchamber for the earliest stage of dressing, while another waits outside for a full additional half hour before his own more limited admission, makes the entire structure of relative favour and standing suddenly viscerally real in a way that no written record of rank could quite replicate. There was an incident this past autumn, still occasionally discussed in careful, lowered tones among the women Isabelle regularly receives, that illustrates how seriously this hierarchy gets taken even in far smaller, more private contexts. A minor dispute arose between two noblewomen, not unlike Isabelle and Celeste in rank, over the correct seating arrangement at a private dinner neither Isabelle nor Etienne actually attended, one woman insisting she had been seated beneath her proper standing, a slight that might sound, to modern ears, almost comically trivial, but that produced within this particular social world a rupture serious enough that the two women's families have barely spoken since, a genuine, lasting coolness grown from what was, at its literal origin, nothing more than the placement of two chairs at a single evening's table. Isabelle finds herself hearing this story again this week from Adelaide during another of the older woman's visits, both amused and faintly troubled by it. Amused at the sheer scale of consequence attached to something so small, troubled by the recognition of how easily she herself might stumble into some similarly disproportionate offence without even realising, in the moment, that she had given offence at all. This is one of the quieter anxieties that never fully leaves a woman in her position, the awareness that the rules governing this world are numerous enough and specific enough that perfect compliance across an entire lifetime remains realistically impossible, and that any single lapse, however unintentional, carries the potential to unravel relationships built carefully across years. She thinks of this sometimes at night, an anxiety that surfaces occasionally alongside the other, deeper one she carries about her lost pregnancy, though this one feels considerably smaller in scale, more manageable, more the ordinary background hum of a life built around constant careful management, rather than any true source of grief. Still, it is there, and she has learnt, across 11 years, that acknowledging its presence honestly, even briefly, late at night in the privacy of her own thoughts, makes it considerably easier to carry through the following day's inevitable small performances. Spring, when it finally arrives after the long stretch of winter, changes the texture of the household's days noticeably, and Isabelle finds herself, on the first actually warm morning of the season, opening her bedchamber window fully rather than merely cracking it, letting in air that carries none of winter's wood smoke, only the particular green smell of the gardens below beginning to wake from their months of dormancy. The elaborate parterres that sat dark and geometric beneath winter's bare branches begin filling in again with colour, and the household's whole daily rhythm shifts outward. More time spent walking the garden paths, more visitors received in the small private terrace attached to a neighbouring apartment, rather than indoors by the fire. Isabelle takes Marguerite and Julien for a walk through a section of the gardens rarely crowded with other courtiers, a quieter path that winds past a smaller ornamental pond, and there is a genuine pleasure in this outing that has nothing to do with any of the season's more formal obligations, simply a mother and her two children, unhurried, watching a pair of ducks make their way across the pond's still water, while Julien narrates, with great seriousness, an entirely invented drama unfolding between them. Marguerite, older now by nearly a full year since we first met her at her mother's dressing table, walks with a slightly more composed bearing than her brother, already beginning to absorb, without any direct instruction, some of the careful self-presentation that will govern so much of her adult life, though she has not yet lost, watching the ducks with her brother, the easy, unguarded delight of simple childhood pleasure. The ornamental pond itself has its own small history worth pausing on, one of countless similar features scattered across the palace grounds, most of them entirely unremarkable to the thousands of courtiers who pass them daily without a second glance, and yet each one representing an engineering achievement that would have seemed, to anyone outside this particular world, almost unbelievable in its ambition. The water feeding this pond, like nearly every fountain and pool across the grounds, arrives through a vast underground network of pipes and reservoirs, drawing from sources sometimes miles distant, an infrastructure project so enormous in its original construction that it employed, according to the accounts Isabelle has heard from Etienne, tens of thousands of labourers across many years, some portion of whom, the stories suggest, did not survive the gruelling conditions of the work. a detail that surfaces occasionally in court conversation and then, just as quickly, gets set aside again. The human cost of the palace's beauty rarely lingered on for long by the people who benefit most directly from it. Isabelle does not dwell on this either. Walking her children past the pond's still surface this particular spring morning, though she is not entirely unaware of it, has thought about it before, in scattered private moments, a strange quiet arithmetic underlying so much of the beauty she moves through every day without a second thought. She sets it aside now too, the way she sets aside most things too large to fully examine during an ordinary walk with her children, and simply watches Julien crouch at the pond's edge, reaching toward the ducks with a handful of breadcrumbs Perini packed for exactly this purpose, his whole small body vibrating with the particular focused delight that 6-year-olds bring to the simplest of pleasures. Back at the apartment that afternoon, Isabelle finds a letter waiting from Celeste, an invitation to a small private gathering planned for the following week, and reading it, she notices, with the particular sharp attentiveness she has developed over years of exactly this kind of correspondence, a subtle shift in her friend's usual tone, slightly more formal than the letters they typically exchange, a small hint that something has changed, however slightly, in the current state of their friendship. She mentions this to Etienne over dinner that evening, and he, more attuned than she sometimes gives him credit for to the currents running beneath the household's various social relationships, suggests it may have something to do with the appointment the Montclair family secured last autumn, a piece of good fortune that appears, based on what he has heard through his own channels, to have finally begun translating into real advancement for the family. Advancement that may well be reshaping, subtly, the whole map of alliances and rivalries that Isabelle and Celeste have moved through together for over 2 decades. This is the kind of small, quiet recalibration that happens constantly beneath the surface of noble life at Versailles. Rarely dramatic, rarely spoken of directly, simply a slow, continuous shifting of relative position that every family here learns to track with the same careful attention a sailor might give to subtle changes in wind and current. Isabelle decides, turning the matter over across the following days, that she will attend Celeste's gathering as planned, warmly, without any visible acknowledgement of the small shift she has noticed, trusting that whatever adjustment is happening between their two families will work itself out gradually, the way these things generally do, without requiring any direct confrontation that might do more damage than the original unspoken shift itself. There is a particular evening, not long after this exchange of letters, when Isabelle and Etienne find themselves with an unusually quiet stretch of time together. No dinner guests, no pressing correspondence, the children already asleep, and they spend it discussing, with more openness than either typically allows themselves, the family's longer-term prospects, what kind of match might eventually suit Marguerite, still years off but never entirely absent from a noble parent's calculations, what path might best serve Julien as he grows, whether the family's finances, still carrying that quiet burden of debt Isabelle glimpsed weeks earlier, might improve enough in coming years to ease the constant careful economizing that fills so much of her own daily labor. Etienne admits in this rare unguarded conversation a worry he has clearly been carrying alone for some time, that the family's position, however secure it currently appears from the outside, remains more fragile than most people watching from a distance would ever guess, dependent on a continued chain of small favors and careful alliances that could in theory unravel faster than it was built if fortune turned even modestly against them. Isabelle listens without judgment, without the reflexive reassurance she might have offered earlier in their marriage, before she came to understand how much her husband actually needs, in these rare moments, simply to be heard rather than immediately soothed. She offers, instead, her own honest assessment, built from years of her own careful tracking of the household's finances and social position, a slightly more optimistic reading than his, grounded in specific observations he had not fully considered. The genuine goodwill Adelaide still holds for the family despite her age and diminishing direct influence, the promising conversation Etienne himself had with the minister at the recent ball, the simple fact that 11 years of careful, patient positioning have built a foundation considerably sturdier than either of them, in a moment of shared worry, tends to fully credit. Etienne seems visibly comforted by this, not because Isabelle has solved anything in any concrete sense, but because the act of laying the worry out honestly between them, rather than each carrying a private, unspoken version of it separately, makes the whole burden feel, if not lighter exactly, then at least more bearable, shared rather than solitary. This is, Isabelle thinks later, lying beside her husband as the candle burns down toward its final inch, one of the genuine gifts of a marriage built across enough years to have weathered real difficulty together, not the absence of worry which never fully disappears in a life built this precariously on the shifting sands of royal favour and social positioning, but the presence of a second person who understands the specific shape of that worry well enough to share its weight without requiring lengthy explanation. She did not have this in her first years here, arriving frightened and largely alone despite her new husband's presence beside her. She has it now, hard-won across more than a decade, and she finds herself drifting finally towards sleep, quietly grateful for it, in a way that has nothing to do with sapphires or silk or any of the more visible markers of the life she leads. Summer, when it arrives fully across the gardens beyond the Beaumont apartment, brings its own particular set of pleasures and obligations, and one occasion in particular stands out this year, a grand evening fireworks display held to mark a royal celebration, drawing nearly the entire court out onto the terraces and garden paths after dark to watch. Isabelle has seen perhaps a dozen of these displays across her years at Versailles, and they retain, even now, a genuine power to astonish her, the sheer scale of the spectacle, gunpowder, and careful engineering combining to throw brilliant colour across a night sky in patterns that would have seemed, to her own grandmother's generation, closer to sorcery than craft. The whole family attends together this time, an unusual arrangement since occasions like this typically fall past the children's normal bedtime, but Etienne insisted, weeks in advance, that Marguerite and Julien were old enough now to experience it properly, and Isabelle, watching her son's face tilted back toward the sky as the first burst of gold and crimson light unfolds above the darkened gardens, finds herself entirely in agreement with her husband's judgment. Julien actually gasps aloud at the first explosion, a small, involuntary sound of pure astonishment that makes several nearby courtiers smile, and Marguerite, trying valiantly to maintain the composed bearing she has been practicing so diligently in recent months, eventually abandons the effort entirely, gripping her mother's hand tightly as successive bursts of light and sound roll across the assembled crowd. There is a particular quality to watching fireworks alongside several thousand other people, all of them, for these brief minutes, entirely united in simple shared wonder, that strips away, however temporarily, nearly all of the careful hierarchy and calculation that otherwise governs every interaction within these walls. Isabelle notices this with real interest, standing beside Etienne in the warm summer darkness, the two of them pressed close together in the crowd, close enough that she can feel him laugh, unguarded, at a particularly dramatic burst of colour, a version of shared, uncomplicated pleasure that occasions like this one, rare as they are, manage to produce in a way that almost nothing else in their daily life together quite matches. The display lasts perhaps 40 minutes, building toward a final, extended sequence that draws an audible gasp from the entire assembled crowd. Thousands of voices responding in near unison to the same burst of spectacular light, and when it finally ends, the night settling back into ordinary darkness, broken only by scattered torches and lanterns, there is a particular hush that follows, a shared moment of quiet before the crowd begins, gradually, to disperse, and the usual low murmur of conversation resumes. Isabelle finds herself walking back toward the apartment with her family, Julien already yawning heavily against her shoulder where Etienne has lifted him for the walk home, truly happy in a way that feels uncomplicated, rare enough in this particular life that she takes real note of it, filing the feeling away alongside the memory of that snowbound afternoon 2 winters back, another small collection of moments that belong entirely to the family itself, untouched by any of the surrounding performance. There is a curious historical detail worth pausing on here, one that occurred to Isabelle only recently, prompted by an offhand comment from a visiting cousin who works in trade and finds the whole apparatus of court life faintly baffling from the outside. The great mirrors lining the famous gallery where Isabelle and Etienne walked just weeks ago represented, At the time of the palace's original construction, an act of genuine technological and economic significance far beyond simple decoration, mirror glass of that size and clarity had been, for generations before the palace's construction, a closely guarded secret of Venetian craftsmen, and producing hundreds of such mirrors domestically required, according to the accounts Isabelle has heard, a substantial and somewhat underhanded effort to lure skilled Venetian glassmakers away from their homeland, smuggled into France under circumstances shadowy enough that several accounts suggest genuine danger followed those craftsmen for the rest of their lives, their former countrymen viewing their departure as a serious betrayal of valuable trade secrets. Isabelle finds herself thinking of this now, with a slightly different eye than she might have a decade ago, walking that same gallery in the years since without ever once considering what lay behind its glittering, seemingly effortless surface. So much of this palace works this way, she realizes, turning the thought over, a magnificent, seemingly natural surface concealing, just beneath it, an enormous and often difficult labor, whether it is the underground pipes feeding the ornamental ponds, or the smuggled craftsmen who first learned to produce mirrors of this scale, or, closer to home, her own quiet daily management of the household's finances, invisible to nearly everyone who ever sees the finished, effortless result. The palace, in this sense, is simply an enormous, elaborate version of the same principle that governs Isabelle's own smallest daily performances, effort concealed everywhere beneath the appearance of ease, all the way from the grandest architectural achievement down to the precise angle of a single woman's bow. Celeste's gathering, the one whose invitation carried that subtle shift in tone weeks earlier, turns out, in the end, to pass warmly and without incident. Whatever small recalibration was happening between the two families, apparently settling itself without requiring any direct acknowledgement from either woman. Isabelle leaves the evening reassured, the friendship intact, if perhaps subtly, permanently altered, in ways that will likely only become fully visible across further months and years, the slow accumulating drift of two families whose relative fortunes have begun, gently, to diverge. This is simply how these things tend to resolve here, rarely through confrontation, almost always through this kind of patient, watchful waiting, each woman allowing the relationship room to settle into whatever new shape it needs to take, without either one forcing the issue. Autumn returns again, a full year now since the evening we first stepped into this apartment, and there is a particular satisfaction Isabelle takes in noticing the return of this season. The same chill creeping back into the mornings, the same shift in the household's daily bread, the same careful airing of heavier wool fabrics that Claudine and Perrine manage each year with practiced efficiency. There is comfort in this cyclical quality to noble life at Versailles, Isabelle has come to realize across her 11 years here, a comfort easy to miss beneath all the constant social maneuvering and careful performance, but real nonetheless. The sense that whatever difficulties any given season brings, the larger pattern of the year continues, reliable and unchanging, gardens blooming and fading and blooming again, fires lit and banked and lit again, an underlying rhythm steadier than any single day's particular triumphs or worries. Marguerite has grown noticeably across this past year, and Isabelle finds herself watching her daughter, now nearly 10, practicing an increasingly polished curtsy in the sitting room mirror without any prompting at all, feeling a complicated mixture of pride and something closer to wistfulness, watching her eldest child absorb, seemingly by simple daily exposure, so much of the careful self-presentation that took Isabelle herself years of anxious trial and error to master properly. There is an ease to Marguerite's growing competence that Isabelle did not have at the same age, raised as she was in a considerably more modest household in Burgundy, before her sudden immersion into the full complexity of Versailles at 19, and she finds herself grateful, watching her daughter, that whatever difficulties this life presents, at least Marguerite will not face the particular disorientation of Isabelle's own first bewildering year here. Arriving already fluent in a language Isabelle herself had to learn from scratch as a frightened young bride. Julian, for his part, remains delightfully himself, 7 years old now, still resistant to Latin, though slightly less openly rebellious about it than he was a year ago, having apparently concluded, with the pragmatic logic of a child who has decided a battle is not worth continued fighting, that the tutor's demands are simply an unavoidable feature of his days. tolerable if not exactly welcome. He has developed over this past year a genuine passion for drawing, filling page after page of paper with increasingly ambitious attempts at capturing the horses he sees during the family's occasional walks through the palace's stables, and Isabelle has taken to keeping a small collection of his favourite efforts in a drawer of her own writing desk alongside her father's old letter, a private gallery of her son's growing skill that she suspects will mean more to her decades from now than nearly any of the palace's grander artistic treasures. There is a particular evening this autumn, one Isabelle finds herself returning to in memory more often than the moment's outward unremarkability would seem to justify, when the whole family gathers for an ordinary dinner, nothing special about the occasion itself, no guests, no particular news to discuss, simply the five of them, including for once the governess Madame Fontaine invited to join rather than eating separately as usual, sharing a meal together with an ease that has become, gradually, across these years, simply the ordinary texture of the household rather than any special occasion requiring particular note. Julien tells a long, elaborate, only partially coherent story about an adventure he has apparently invented involving his wooden horse and an imaginary journey to a distant, entirely fictional kingdom, and the whole table listens with genuine attention. Even Marguerite, old enough now to find some of her brother's more fantastical claims faintly ridiculous but clearly still fond enough of him to indulge the telling without complaint. Isabelle watches this unremarkable, entirely ordinary dinner unfold with a particular kind of attention she has learned, across these 11 years, to bring specifically to moments like this one, the quiet, unglamorous, entirely private texture of a family simply existing together, and she finds herself thinking, not for the first time, that this, more than any ball or gown or carefully calculated social alliance, is probably the truest measure of whether this particular life, built as it is on so much performance and calculation, has actually succeeded at its most basic, most human task. Whatever else Versailles demands of the Beaumont family, whatever elaborate machinery of appearance and positioning fills so much of their days, this dinner table, this ordinary evening, this small collection of people who really, unperformed, care for one another, remains untouched by any of it, a private centre that all the surrounding grandeur has never quite managed to reach. There is a particular walk Isabelle takes alone one afternoon this same autumn, unusual for her, since her days rarely permit truly solitary time, but Etienne has taken the children to visit a family friend's apartment for the afternoon, and Isabelle, finding herself briefly and unexpectedly alone, decides to walk a section of the gardens she rarely visits, a quieter stretch near the edge of the grounds where the elaborate formal plantings begin, giving way to something slightly wilder, less rigorously maintained. She walks slowly, without any particular destination, simply enjoying the rare sensation of moving through this enormous place with no audience at all, no need to manage her expression or her pace or the precise angle of her greeting to anyone she might pass. It occurs to her, walking this quiet path, how rarely she experiences Versailles this way, as a physical place rather than as a stage, and she finds herself noticing details she suspects she has walked past 100 times without ever truly seeing them. The particular texture of a stone wall along one edge of the path, worn smooth in places by countless hands over generations, a small, unremarkable wildflower growing in a crack where the formal gardening has not quite managed to reach, the specific quality of afternoon light filtering through a stand of trees this far from the palace's grandest, most carefully manicured sections. There is a version of beauty here, she thinks, considerably quieter than anything on display in the Hall of Mirrors, and she finds herself wondering, walking this rarely visited path, how much of this quieter beauty she has simply failed to notice across 11 years of moving through this place with her attention fixed, always, on the more visible, more consequential performance filling the foreground of her days. She returns to the apartment before Etienne and the children, in time to have Claudine help her change before the family's return, and there is something she finds herself quietly protecting about this particular afternoon's solitary walk, a small private experience she does not fully share even with Etienne later that evening, mentioning only briefly that she walked in the gardens for a while, without elaborating on the particular quality of attention she brought to it, or the quiet, unexpected pleasure she found in simply noticing, for once, the actual physical world around her rather than the elaborate social performance layered on top of it. Some experiences, she has come to understand, remain more fully themselves if kept private, held close rather than immediately shared, and this quiet autumn walk has become, in the days since, one of those experiences, a small treasured secret she carries with her, the way she carries the memory of her father's letter, or the enamel box of her children's baby teeth, small unglamorous things that matter far more than their outward modesty would ever suggest. There is one more piece of this household worth understanding before we settle fully into the quiet hours ahead, and it concerns a particular kind of knowledge that Isabelle has accumulated across her years here, one rarely discussed openly but present, in some form, in nearly every noble household at Versailles. It is the knowledge of exactly how much can be borrowed against a family's future without permanently damaging its standing. A delicate calculation that Etienne handles in its broad strokes, but that Isabelle, in the smaller daily details, manages with a precision that would surprise most people who know her only through her carefully composed public presentation. She keeps, in a locked ledger stored in the same drawer that holds her father's letter, a running account of the household's actual expenses, a document considerably more honest and more detailed than anything Etienne's own steward maintains, cross-referencing what the family spends on maintaining appearances against what actually flows in from their countryside estate near Chartres each quarter. It is not glamorous work, and it is work that would seem, to anyone raised with modern assumptions about noble women of this era, entirely at odds with the popular image of decorative, largely helpless aristocratic wives, concerned only with fashion and gossip. Isabelle has never found that popular image to bear much resemblance to her own actual daily reality, or to that of nearly any woman she knows well in her own social circle. The fashion and the gossip exist, truly, woven through every day, but beneath them runs this other, considerably more practical labour, largely invisible, almost entirely unacknowledged, and sincerely essential to the family's continued survival within a world this expensive to simply remain visible in. She has, across this particular autumn, identified a modest but meaningful savings achievable through a change in how the household purchases its candles, switching a portion of their supply from the finest wax variety to a slightly less expensive grade for use in rooms where guests rarely venture, a distinction subtle enough that it required weeks of careful attention to implement without anyone beyond Claudine and the household steward ever noticing the shift. It is precisely the kind of unglamorous, entirely uncelebrated competence that Isabelle has come to take a quiet private pride in, this ability to protect the family's visible performance of ease while managing, behind the scenes, an entirely different and considerably more effortful reality. Etienne knows about this ledger, in general terms, though he has never examined its details closely, content to trust his wife's judgment in this particular domain, the way he trusts her judgment in the equally intricate social calculations that govern the family's standing at court. There is a particular kind of marriage that grows from this arrangement, Isabelle has come to understand across these 11 years, one built less on the romantic ideals young brides are sometimes raised to expect, and more on this steady, practical division of deeply essential labour, each partner managing a different but equally essential domain of the family's continued survival, trusting the other's competence without needing to fully understand or oversee its particular details. It is not, perhaps, the marriage Isabelle imagined as a girl in Burgundy, reading the romantic novels her mother mildly disapproved of, but it has become, across more than a decade, something she values considerably more than she once expected to, precisely because it has proven itself, repeatedly, reliable in exactly the ways that actually matter. The dowager's health has begun, this past autumn, to show the first small signs of genuine decline. Nothing dramatic, simply a slower pace to her once brisk walk through the apartment, a tendency to tire somewhat earlier in her visits than she once did, and Isabelle finds herself watching this gradual change in a woman whose relationship with her has never been especially warm, surprised by the genuine tenderness it produces in her, a protective concern that has nothing to do with any resolved affection between them and everything to do with the simple, undeniable fact of watching someone grow visibly older and more fragile after knowing them for over a decade. She mentions this concern to Etienne one evening, And he admits, with a candour that still occasionally surprises her even after all these years together, that he has noticed the same thing and finds it considerably more unsettling than he has let on, a reminder, uncomfortable in its clarity, of his own mother's eventual mortality, and, by uncomfortable extension, his own. They do not dwell on this conversation for long. It is not the kind of subject that lends itself to extended discussion, even between two people as plainly close as Isabelle and Etienne have become across their years together. But Isabelle notices, in the days following, a small shift in how Etienne treats his mother's visits, a slightly greater patience with her occasional critical comments, a willingness to sit with her a few minutes longer than strictly necessary, and she recognizes it for what it is, her husband's own quiet, largely unspoken way of preparing himself for a loss that has not yet arrived, but that both of them can now see, more clearly than before, gathering somewhere on the horizon of the years ahead. Winter arrives once more, completing the full cycle of a single year within this household, and there is something Isabelle finds herself noticing this particular winter that she had not consciously registered in quite the same way during previous years, the sheer accumulated weight of memory now attached to nearly every room and object in this apartment. The dressing table where we first found her, hair half undone, holds now not just tonight's routine but 11 years of nearly identical evenings stacked invisibly on top of one another. The nursery holds not just Julian's current collection of drawings, but the ghost of every earlier version of both children who have passed through that room across the years, infants who became toddlers, who became the increasingly capable, increasingly distinct young people currently occupying those same small beds. This accumulated weight does not feel heavy exactly. Walking through the apartment on a quiet evening this particular winter, candle in hand, checking as she still does most nights on her sleeping children, it feels instead something closer to substantial, a kind of density that comes only with real duration, real years actually lived rather than merely imagined or anticipated. Isabelle arrived here at 19, with almost nothing of her own beyond a single portrait of her mother and a considerable amount of anxious uncertainty about what this new life would actually require of her. She stands now, 11 years later, in an apartment thick with the accumulated texture of an entire life actually built, imperfect in places, genuinely difficult in others, but real in a way that the frightened 19-year-old bride could not possibly have imagined on that first disorienting day. There is a small piece of news this winter that brings Isabelle genuine, uncomplicated pleasure, unconnected to any of the household's usual careful calculations of advantage and positioning. Claudine, after years of careful, patient courtship conducted mostly through brief exchanges during her limited free hours, has finally received a proposal from the footman Isabelle has long suspected she favoured, a steady, well-regarded young man named Matthew, employed in a neighbouring household, and Claudine comes to Isabelle with the news on a quiet afternoon, uncharacteristically nervous, asking, with real hesitation, whether Isabelle might be willing to help negotiate the small financial arrangements such a marriage requires, and whether Claudine might, if the marriage proceeds, be permitted to continue in her position at least part-time, since neither she nor Matthew can yet afford a household without her continued wages. Isabelle agrees immediately, warmly, actually delighted for a woman who has served her with real skill and real loyalty across 14 years, and there is a particular tenderness to the conversation that follows, the two women, mistress and servant, sitting together in a way that briefly, entirely sets aside the usual careful hierarchy governing their relationship, simply two women discussing marriage and love and the particular anxieties that accompany both, regardless of the very different worlds they each inhabit. Isabelle offers to speak with Etienne about a modest wedding gift, offers her own guidance on managing the early financial pressures of a new marriage, drawing on her own hard-won expertise, and Claudine, visibly moved by the warmth of the response, thanks her with a sincerity that carries considerably more weight than the formal courtesies that typically pass between them. This small piece of news occupies a disproportionate amount of Isabelle's attention over the following days, and she finds herself turning it over during quiet moments, wholeheartedly happy in a way that feels refreshingly uncomplicated compared to so much of what fills her usual days. No careful calculation required, No assessment of advantage or positioning, simply real pleasure at watching someone she has come to care for across many years find a piece of happiness entirely her own. She mentions it to Etienne over dinner, and he, without pretense fond of Claudine himself after so many years of her steady presence in the household, agrees readily to whatever gift Isabelle thinks appropriate, and the two of them spend a portion of that evening discussing, with real warmth, the small practical details of helping arrange a wedding for two people whose happiness in this particular instance requires nothing more complicated from either of them than genuine goodwill and a modest financial contribution. The sapphire necklace makes its reappearance this winter too, at another formal court occasion, and Isabelle finds herself fastening the small clasp with Claudine's now familiar assistance, thinking back to that first fitting nearly a year ago, the cold thread of worry about age and fading currency that surfaced then, unbidden, in front of the mirror. The worry has not entirely disappeared across the intervening months, she acknowledges to herself honestly, catching her own reflection now in considerably better light than that earlier fitting offered, but it sits somewhat differently than it did, softened perhaps by the accumulated weight of everything else this year has held. Claudine's happiness, the fireworks display, the quiet solitary walk through the garden's wilder edges, the ordinary family dinner that meant more than any grand ball. Whatever this particular life eventually asks of her as she continues to age within it, she suspects now, with a confidence she did not quite have a year ago, that she will find a way to meet it, the way she has found a way to meet everything else this demanding, beautiful, exhausting place has required of her across more than a decade. The lost pregnancy from 2 years back surfaces once more this particular winter, prompted by nothing in particular, simply the quiet turning of her own private thoughts during another late evening alone with her embroidery, and Isabelle finds, examining the memory now with the accumulated distance of additional time, that it has settled into something she can hold a little more gently than she once could, not resolved exactly. Grief of that particular kind rarely resolves in any clean final sense, but integrated now into the larger fabric of everything else this year and the years before it have held. She still has not spoken of it directly to Etienne, still carries it in that quiet interior place reserved for the things too large for ordinary daily conversation, but she finds herself wondering, this particular evening, whether she might eventually find the right quiet moment to finally set at least part of that private weight down between them, the way they set down the worry about the family's finances that evening months ago, sharing it rather than each carrying some separate, solitary version alone. She does not decide anything definite tonight. It is simply a thought that surfaces, gently, and she lets it sit, unresolved, the way she has learnt to let many things sit without requiring immediate resolution, trusting that the right moment, when it eventually arrives, will make itself known clearly enough that she will recognize it. This is, perhaps, one of the quieter lessons these 11 years at Versailles have taught her, beneath all the more visible lessons about fashion and hierarchy and careful social management, the understanding that not everything requires immediate action, that some things simply need time and patience and the accumulated trust of a genuine partnership before they can finally, safely be set down. Let me tell you a little more about the particular texture of a single ordinary night in this apartment, because it is in these unremarkable hours, more than in any grand ball or fireworks display, that the true rhythm of this household actually lives. It is well past midnight now, in this particular telling, deep enough into the night that even Versailles, restless and enormous as it is, has finally settled into something close to true quiet. Isabelle lies awake a while longer than usual tonight, not from any particular worry, simply the ordinary wakefulness that sometimes visits even the most settled sleeper, and she finds herself listening, in the darkness, to the small sounds the apartment makes at this hour, a settling creak somewhere in the old wooden floorboards, the faint tick of the mantel clock in the sitting room, still running its stubborn 4 minutes fast, the almost imperceptible sound of Etienne's breathing beside her, slow and even, already deep in sleep. There is a particular comfort in this kind of wakefulness, she has come to realize across many similar nights, a wakefulness that carries no anxiety within it, simply the quiet awareness of being alive, in this specific room, on this specific night, surrounded by the accumulated evidence of a life actually lived rather than merely imagined, she can make out, even in the near dark, the familiar shapes of the room around her, the wardrobe where Claudine hung tonight's discarded gown, the small writing desk with its locked drawer holding her father's letter and Julian's drawings, the gilt frame near the door holding her mother's portrait, barely visible now, reduced to a pale rectangle against the darker wall. She thinks, in this quiet drifting stretch before sleep finally claims her, of the particular arc this single year has traced, beginning with an ordinary evening much like this one, Claudine working a comb through her hair and moving through everything since, the ball and its careful gown, the snowbound afternoon 2 winters back that still surfaces in memory, the fireworks that made Julian gasp aloud, Claudine's own quiet happiness finally realized, the dowager's gradual, gentle decline, the private, unshared weight of a grief she still has not fully set down but has learned, slowly, to carry a little more easily. It has been, she thinks, drifting now toward the edge of sleep herself, a year both entirely ordinary and, in its accumulated particulars, in real earnest remarkable, the way any single year of an actual life lived carefully turns out to be, on close examination, considerably richer than it appears from any greater distance. Outside, beyond the window she still keeps cracked even now in the depths of winter. The palace continues its low, constant murmur, indifferent as ever to any single family's particular joys or worries, and there is something Isabelle finds truly peaceful in that indifference tonight, the knowledge that this enormous building will continue exactly as it has for generations, regardless of whatever happens within these particular 5 rooms, that the Beaumont family's whole elaborate performance of relevance and positioning, however consuming it feels from the inside, remains, in the larger scheme of this place's long history, simply one small thread among countless others, no more or less significant than any of the thousands of other private lives unfolding simultaneously behind other doors along these same endless corridors. There is a particular quality to the very last stretch of night before dawn, the hour when even the palace's persistent background sounds finally, briefly, fall almost entirely silent, and it is here, in this deepest, quietest stretch, that we will leave this household for tonight, the whole apartment settled into its most complete stillness, Etienne breathing slow and even beside his wife, Marguerite and Julian asleep in the next room with Madame Fontaine listening, as she always does, for any small stirring that might require her attention, Claudine and Perrine asleep in their own small shared room off the service passage, the whole intricate, carefully balanced machinery of this particular noble household, finally, entirely at rest. Isabelle herself drifts, finally fully into sleep sometime in this deepest hour, her last waking thought, as it so often is, a small quiet inventory of the people she loves, arranged not by rank or standing, the careful hierarchy that governs nearly every other aspect of her waking hours, but simply by the plain, uncomplicated fact of how much each of them means to her, Etienne beside her, Marguerite and Julian just beyond the wall, even Claudine, even the dowager whose health worries her now more than she would have predicted a year ago, even, in some smaller, gentler way, the memory of the child she lost, still carried, still loved, even now, even here, in this palace built so entirely around performance and appearance, where somehow, against considerable odds, something really real has managed to take root and grow across 11 patient years. This is what a home at Versailles actually looks like, once you set aside the mirrors and the gilt and the carefully choreographed public performance that most accounts of this place tend to focus on entirely. It looks like this, an ordinary family, imperfect and sincerely loving, managing an extraordinary amount of quiet, largely invisible labor to maintain a life that from the outside appears effortless, carrying private griefs and private joys through rooms that have held 11 years of nearly identical evenings, finding in the small unglamorous moments a fire built up large on a snowbound afternoon, a footman's proposal to a beloved lady's maid, a walk along a garden's quieter edges, the particular kind of contentment that all the sapphires and silk in the world could never quite manufacture on their own. Let me linger a little longer in this world before we let it rest fully, because there are still a few more small corners of this life worth exploring, the kind of details that reward patience rather than urgency, the kind best saved for exactly this deep, unhurried hour, Consider for a moment the elaborate world of the small beauty patches fashionable among court ladies of Isabel's generation, tiny pieces of black silk or velvet, cut into simple shapes, a small circle, an occasional star, applied to the face at carefully considered positions that carry, among those fluent in the custom, an entire unspoken vocabulary. A patch near the corner of the eye signals one thing, a patch near the mouth signals something else entirely. Isabel wears them sparingly herself, finding the more elaborate versions of the fashion. Several patches arranged across a single face in an intricate pattern, faintly excessive for her own more restrained taste, but she keeps a small collection in an enameled box on her dressing table regardless, alongside her powder and her rouge, applying a single small patch near her temple on evenings that call for slightly more formal presentation than an ordinary day requires. There is a particular story behind the custom worth knowing, though Isabel herself only learned it properly from Adelaide, who seems to hold, somewhere in her considerable memory, an explanation for nearly every fashion currently in circulation at court. The patches originated, generations back, from a more practical need entirely, concealing the scarring that smallpox left on so many faces of that earlier era, before gradually, over decades, transforming from practical concealment into pure decorative fashion, worn now by women whose skin carries no scarring at all, simply because the custom itself had, by Isabel's own generation, become its own independent tradition, entirely detached from its original purpose. Isabel finds this particular transformation quietly fascinating whenever she thinks of it. The way fashion here so often works this way, a practical origin slowly dissolving into pure aesthetic custom, until eventually almost nobody wearing the fashion remembers, or particularly cares, why it began in the first place. Card games occupy a considerable portion of the household's evening entertainment across the colder months, and Isabel has become, over her years at court, a deeply skilled player of several fashionable games, skilled enough that she occasionally wins small sums from opponents who underestimate her, a habit of underestimation she has learnt to quietly exploit without ever appearing to seek the advantage too obviously. There is real money involved in these games, sometimes substantial amounts among the wealthiest players, and Isabel has watched, over the years, more than one noble family's fortunes suffer real damage from a husband's or occasionally a wife's persistent gambling habit, a genuine danger lurking beneath the pleasant surface of an evening's card game that she and Etienne have both, by mutual quiet agreement, always been careful to avoid indulging too heavily. There was an incident several years back now, involving a neighbouring family whose name Isabel still avoids mentioning too specifically even in private conversation, a young nobleman whose gambling losses across a single particularly disastrous winter forced his family to sell a substantial portion of their countryside land, a fall from grace steep enough and public enough that it still occasionally surfaces as a cautionary tale among the women Isabel regularly receives, a story told, always, with a particular tone of careful sympathy layered thinly over what Isabel suspects is a considerable amount of private relief among the tellers that the same misfortune has not befallen their own households. This is one of the quieter cruelties of life at Versailles that Isabel has come to recognize clearly across her years here, the way genuine sympathy for another family's misfortune so often travels alongside an unspoken, barely acknowledged gratitude that the misfortune belongs to someone else. Snuff, too, has become a fashionable habit among a portion of the court, Etienne included, though he indulges only occasionally, keeping a small, elegantly decorated box for the purpose that Isabel gave him as a gift several New Years back, chosen specifically for its restrained, tasteful design rather than the more ostentatious versions favoured by some of his acquaintances. She finds the habit itself faintly curious, has never developed any taste for it herself despite it being not uncommon among fashionable women too, and watches, sometimes, with a mixture of affection and mild amusement, as Etienne performs the small elaborate ritual of taking a pinch, the careful tap of the box, the particular practiced motion, one more small piece of the endless choreography of gesture and custom that fills nearly every hour of life within these walls. A royal birth was announced this past spring, elsewhere within the palace, an event that produced its own ripple of formal celebration throughout the court, bonfires lit across the grounds, An extra ration of wine distributed to the household staff in every apartment, a formal service of thanksgiving that the entire Beaumont family attended, along with what felt like the whole of Versailles crowded into the chapel at once. Isabelle remembers the particular quality of that celebration, genuine warmth mixed with the usual careful public performance, courtiers competing, in their various expressions of joy, to appear the most sincerely delighted, a competition so thoroughly embedded in the fabric of court life that even an occasion as simple and universally welcome as a royal birth cannot entirely escape its logic. And yet, watching Marguerite and Julien both caught up in the genuine, uncomplicated excitement of the bonfires that evening, the whole family gathered on a terrace to watch the flames leap against the darkening sky. Isabelle found herself, that particular evening, largely able to set aside her usual careful attention to who around her was performing joy most convincingly, simply enjoying, alongside her children, the plain visual pleasure of fire against dusk, a pleasure requiring no calculation at all, available equally to a duke and to the lowest servant watching from some distant window, one of the rare occasions when Versailles' endless machinery of hierarchy briefly, plainly, dissolves into something closer to shared, uncomplicated human delight. There is a final thread worth following before we let this particular story settle fully into rest, one concerning the household's oldest and most faithful servant, a man named old Grégoire, who has tended the Beaumont family's small stable of carriage horses for nearly 30 years, since Etienne's own father first employed him as a young groom. Grégoire lives in a modest room above the stables rather than within the family's own apartment, a separation of quarters typical for staff whose work centres on animals rather than the household proper, and Isabelle sees him perhaps once a week when the family requires a carriage for some errand beyond the palace grounds. But she has come, over her years here, to hold a particular fondness for the old man, who speaks to the horses in a low, constant murmur that Isabelle finds strangely soothing whenever she happens to overhear it, a running commentary of gentle reassurance that never seems to fully stop, whether he is harnessing a horse for departure or simply mucking out a stall on an ordinary afternoon. Grégoire remembers Etienne as a small boy, has stories from those decades that Isabelle finds genuinely delightful whenever the old man can be coaxed into sharing them. A young Etienne apparently once attempting, at perhaps 7 years old, to ride one of his father's largest carriage horses entirely without permission, resulting in a minor mishap that left the boy with a scraped knee, and a story that Grégoire has clearly told many times since with evident relish. Isabelle finds these small glimpses into her husband's childhood, offered second-hand through an old groom's fond, well-worn anecdotes, actually precious, a version of Etienne that predates all the careful court composure she has known for 11 years, a small boy still curious and reckless enough to climb onto a horse 3 times his own size, simply because the possibility of doing so seemed, in the moment, considerably more interesting than the alternative of staying safely on the ground. Grégoire's own health, like the dowager's, has begun showing small signs of decline this past year, a persistent cough that lingers longer each winter, a visible slowing in his once brisk movement around the stables, and Isabelle finds herself, on her weekly visits, paying closer attention to these small changes than she once did, a quiet private worry that she has not yet mentioned to Etienne, uncertain whether raising it will prompt the kind of practical action, perhaps easing Grégoire's duties, perhaps bringing in additional help, that the old man's evident pride might actually resist rather than welcome. This is a small ongoing dilemma she carries privately for now, turning it over during her weekly visits to the stables, watching Grégoire work with the same careful, practiced competence he has always shown, trying to judge, from small daily observations, exactly when the moment might arrive that intervention becomes necessary rather than merely considerate. The stables themselves offer a particular sensory experience distinct from anywhere else in the palace grounds, worth pausing on for its own sake. The warm animal smell of horse and hay and leather, considerably more grounding and earthy than the powder and perfume that fills the family's own apartment. The low, constant sound of horses shifting in their stalls, occasionally nickering at some sound or movement beyond human perception. The particular quality of afternoon light filtering through the stable's high windows, dust motes visible drifting slowly through the beams. Isabelle finds a specific, uncomplicated pleasure in these weekly visits that has nothing to do with any of the elaborate performance filling the rest of her days. Simply the plain physical presence of large, gentle animals and an old man's quiet, steady competence, a small corner of Versailles that operates by an entirely different, considerably simpler logic than the rest of the palace's endless, careful choreography. There is one final small story worth telling before this particular night finally settles into full rest, concerning a quiet exchange between Isabelle and Marguerite that happened just this past week, unremarkable in its outward details, but carrying for Isabelle a particular private significance. Marguerite, now approaching her 10th birthday, asked her mother, during an ordinary evening spent together in the sitting room, whether Isabelle had been frightened, arriving at Versailles all those years ago as a young bride barely older than Marguerite will be when her own formal court life eventually begins. Isabelle considered the question carefully before answering, aware that her daughter, perceptive beyond her years in certain particular ways, was asking for something more honest than the polished reassurance a mother might reflexively offer. She told Marguerite the truth, or a carefully chosen portion of it, admitting that yes, she had been frightened, wholeheartedly and considerably, during those first bewildering months, uncertain of the rules, homesick for Burgundy in a way she rarely admits even now, and that the fear had eased gradually, not through any single dramatic transformation, but through the slow, patient accumulation of small competencies and small friendships, Adelaide's early kindness, Claudine's steady loyal presence, and eventually, gradually, a genuine partnership with a husband she had married as a near stranger. Marguerite listened to this with real attention, and asked, after a thoughtful pause, whether Isabelle thought she herself would also be frightened when her own time came. Isabelle told her honestly that she likely would be, at least somewhat, and that this was entirely normal, nothing to be ashamed of or to hide, and that whatever fear Marguerite carried into her own eventual entrance into full court life, she would not be facing it alone, the way Isabelle had largely had to, arriving as an outsider from a family with far fewer established connections within these walls. This conversation has stayed with Isabelle in the days since, a small quiet marker of her daughter growing into someone capable of asking without pretense difficult questions, and receiving in real earnest honest answers, a particular kind of trust between mother and daughter that Isabelle did not entirely have with her own more distant mother, and that she has worked consciously across these years to build differently with Marguerite. It is, she thinks now, settling more fully into the deep quiet of this particular night we have spent so long exploring together, one more small piece of evidence for the larger pattern she has come to recognize across her 11 years in this demanding, beautiful, exhausting place, that whatever else Versailles takes from the people who live within its walls, however much careful performance and constant vigilance it demands, it has not managed, in this particular household at least, to fully extinguish the plainer, more essential things underneath: honest conversation between a mother and daughter, genuine partnership between husband and wife, real loyalty between mistress and servant, the small unglamorous currency of an actual life, actually lived, actually loved. There is a particular corner of the apartment we have not yet visited together, a small library room adjoining Etienne's own study, modest by the palace's grander standards, perhaps 200 volumes arranged along simple wooden shelves, but truly well loved by both husband and wife, each of them keeping a small stack of current reading on a side table near the room's single comfortable chair. Isabelle reads mostly in the evenings, after the household's more formal obligations have concluded, favouring novels and occasionally works of history, and she has developed, across her years here, a genuine, largely private passion for reading that she rarely discusses at length in the more socially oriented conversations that fill so much of her day, aware that overly enthusiastic literary opinion carries a faint risk of seeming pretentious among certain circles at court, though Adelaide, predictably, shares the passion openly, and the two women have spent many pleasant hours across the years discussing whatever novel currently occupies their attention. She is currently partway through a lengthy work of history concerning the reign of a much earlier French king, a subject she finds herself drawn to, partly out of genuine curiosity and partly, she suspects, out of a quieter fascination with understanding how the particular world she currently inhabits came to take its present shape, tracing backward through the accumulated decisions and circumstances of earlier generations to find the roots of customs and hierarchies that now feel to her simply like the fixed, unquestionable furniture of daily existence. There is something clarifying in this kind of reading, she has found, a reminder that even the most seemingly permanent features of her current life, the elaborate court rituals, the careful gradations of rank and favour, were themselves built gradually by particular people making particular choices across particular decades, rather than existing as some eternal, unchangeable law of nature. Etienne's own reading runs in a different direction, mostly practical works concerning estate management and occasionally military history, and there is a particular pleasure the two of them share on quiet evenings when both find themselves in this small library room together, simply reading in companionable silence, occasionally reading a passage aloud to share some particular observation or amusing detail, a version of shared intimacy considerably quieter than the grand public performances of their more formal evenings, but no less genuine for its quietness. Isabelle finds these evenings among her favourite of the entire week, precisely because they require nothing performed at all, simply two people who have built a genuine life together, comfortable enough in each other's presence to spend an hour in companionable silence without any need to fill it with conversation. The library holds, too, a small collection of books belonging specifically to the children, kept on a lower shelf within easy reach, and Isabelle has made a habit, across the years, of reading aloud to both Marguerite and Julian most evenings before their own bedtime, a ritual that predates even Marguerite's earliest clear memories, and that both children still request, even now, with an eagerness that suggests it carries more comfort for them than the simple entertainment of the stories themselves might fully explain. Tonight, in this particular telling, that reading has already concluded some hours earlier, both children long since asleep, but the memory of it lingers in Isabelle's mind as she considers, one more time, before we finally let this household rest, the particular quality of a young child's face listening intently to a familiar story, a version of pure, uncomplicated attention that Isabelle finds increasingly rare and increasingly precious the longer she spends within a world built so entirely around performance and careful calculation. There is a particular late autumn evening, several years back now, that Isabelle finds herself remembering with unusual clarity this same night, prompted by nothing in particular beyond the general drift of memory that tends to accompany these final quiet hours before sleep. Marguerite was perhaps 5 that year, Julien not yet born, and Isabelle remembers reading to her daughter a particular story involving a lost princess finding her way home through an enchanted forest, a story Marguerite requested so many consecutive evenings that Isabelle eventually had the greater portion of it memorized, and she remembers, specifically, one particular evening when Marguerite, drowsy and nearly asleep, asked, in the small unguarded voice children reserve for their most genuine questions, whether Isabelle herself had ever felt lost the way the princess in the story did. Isabelle remembers considering the question carefully even then, when Marguerite was far too young to receive any really complicated answer, and settling on a gentle, simplified version of the truth, admitting that yes, she had felt lost sometimes, especially when she was younger, but that she had always, eventually, found her way to where she needed to be, the same way the princess in the story always did. It was, she recognizes now, remembering this exchange from years back, alongside the more recent, considerably more sophisticated conversation with the same daughter just this past week, an early version of the same essential honesty she has tried, across all these years, to offer Marguerite whenever the sincerely difficult questions arise, calibrated always to what her daughter could actually receive and understand, at whatever particular age she happened to be asking. This, perhaps, is as good a note as any to rest on, this final night, watching this particular family across this particular year, the accumulated small honesties passed quietly between a mother and her children, between a husband and wife who built genuine partnership out of an arranged match neither originally chose, between a mistress and the servants who have shared so much of her daily life across more than a decade, all of it existing quietly beneath the palace's more visible, more famous performance of gilt and mirror and careful ceremony, unglamorous and largely invisible to history's grander accounts of this place, but real and lasting, and in its own quiet way, considerably more remarkable than any single ball or fireworks display or elaborate court ceremony could ever fully capture. There is one more season worth walking through together before we finally let this household settle into its deepest rest, because it would be incomplete to leave this particular year without pausing on the specific texture of an ordinary Sunday, the one day each week when even Versailles' relentless calendar of obligation slows, however slightly, into something closer to genuine rest. The family attends chapel together in the morning, a more formal service than the brief evening prayers that punctuate most ordinary days, and Isabelle finds a particular pleasure in these Sunday mornings that differs from the rest of the week, a chance to sit quietly beside Etienne with both children flanking them, Marguerite solemn and attentive in the way she has recently begun approaching most formal occasions, Julian fidgeting only slightly more than decorum strictly allows, tolerated with the particular indulgent patience that even the most formal occasions at Versailles seem to extend toward children still young enough to be forgiven their restlessness. The afternoon that follows carries a looser, more unstructured quality than any other day of the week, and Isabelle has come to treasure it precisely for that looseness. There are no scheduled visitors on a typical Sunday, no obligatory appearance in the Hall of Mirrors, no dinner shared with neighbouring families requiring the careful coordinated hosting that fills so much of an ordinary Tuesday or Thursday. Instead, the family simply exists together within their own rooms, and Isabelle finds herself, on this particular Sunday she is remembering now, spending a good portion of the afternoon simply sitting with Etienne in the small library, both of them reading, while the children occupy themselves nearby with a game Marguerite has taught Julien, involving a set of small carved animal figures arranged into an elaborate imaginary farm spread across the library's worn carpet. There is a particular sound that fills the apartment on afternoons like this one, worth noting because it differs so completely from the sounds that dominate the rest of the week. No formal footsteps, no rustle of elaborate silk moving through doorways, no careful, modulated conversation calibrated for an audience. Just the small, ordinary sounds of a family occupying shared space together, Julian's occasional soft narration of his imaginary farm's unfolding dramas, the quiet turn of a page from Etienne's chair, the faint scratch of Marguerite's pencil as she attempts, with increasing skill, to sketch one of the carved animals from life, a habit she has apparently picked up from watching her brother's own enthusiasm for drawing. Isabelle finds herself, this particular Sunday afternoon, setting her book aside for a while, simply to watch her family occupy this ordinary shared space, and she is struck, not for the first time, by how rarely she permits herself this particular kind of unhurried attention during the busier stretches of an ordinary week. There is always, on a Tuesday or a Thursday, some next obligation pressing close enough to claim a portion of her attention, even during the family's more relaxed moments together. Some letter still requiring a response, some small calculation about the household's finances, or the family's shifting social position still turning quietly in the back of her mind. Sunday afternoons offer something closer to a genuine pause, and she has learnt, across these 11 years, to recognize their particular value precisely because of how rare that full, unhurried attention actually is within the rest of her carefully scheduled life. The dowager joins them for a portion of this particular Sunday, arriving in the late afternoon as she often does on this one day of the week, when her own schedule too loosens somewhat, and there is a gentler quality to her visit today than the more critical, correcting tone that sometimes governs her weekday appearances. She sits with Julien for a while, watching his imaginary farm unfold with what looks, to Isabelle's deeply surprised eye, like real interest rather than merely polite tolerance, and Isabelle finds herself wondering, watching this unexpected softness in a woman she has spent 11 years learning to carefully manage rather than genuinely relax around, whether age is beginning to wear away some of the older woman's more rigid edges, the same way it has begun, more visibly, to wear away at her physical vigour. Etienne notices this too, exchanging a small private glance with Isabelle across the room, a shared recognition that needs no words to communicate, and there is something quietly moving in this small, unremarkable Sunday afternoon scene, 3 generations of the same family occupying shared space together with none of the usual careful performance, a dowager softened by age watching her grandson's imaginary farm with genuine attention, a mother and father simply reading nearby, a daughter sketching, a son narrating small dramas involving carved wooden animals, The whole scene entirely unremarkable by any grand historical measure, and entirely quietly precious by the measure that actually matters most within these particular walls. By early evening, the household resumes its more ordinary rhythm, the dowager departing before the family's own dinner as she always does, the children eventually retreating to the nursery for their own separate meal, and Isabelle finds herself, once the apartment has settled back into its usual weekday shape, carrying a particular warmth forward from this Sunday afternoon that lingers through the following days, a small store of accumulated contentment that she draws on, almost unconsciously, during the more demanding stretches of the week ahead, the careful social calculations, the elaborate court appearances, the constant vigilant management of appearance that fills so much of her ordinary Tuesday and Thursday hours. There is one further thread worth following, concerning a visit the family received this past year from Isabelle's own mother, travelling from Burgundy for the first time in nearly 3 years, and it deserves its own careful telling because it illuminates something about Isabelle herself that the rest of this story has only gestured toward indirectly. Her mother arrived unannounced beyond a brief letter sent only a fortnight ahead, characteristically abrupt in her manner of doing things, and the visit itself, spanning nearly 2 full weeks, brought back to the surface a whole set of dynamics between mother and daughter that Isabelle had mostly managed to set aside during the years of physical distance separating them. Isabelle's mother has always carried herself with a particular reserve that Isabelle recognized, watching her interact with Marguerite and Julien during this visit, as the same distant correctness that shaped Isabelle's own childhood, a formality that never quite crossed into open warmth even in moments that seemed to call for it. She observed her grandchildren with evident approval, complimented Marguerite's dancing progress and Julien's growing facility with his letters, and yet Isabelle found herself, watching these exchanges, feeling the same faint ache she remembered from her own childhood, the sense of being appraised rather than simply loved, evaluated against some unstated standard rather than accepted plainly for who she actually was. This recognition arrived with a particular clarity during this visit that Isabelle had not expected, and it prompted a conversation between herself and Etienne one evening, after her mother had retired for the night, Isabelle admitting, with more openness than she typically allows herself even in private, that she had spent a good portion of her own girlhood trying to earn a warmth from her mother that never quite arrived in the form she wanted it, and that she had made a conscious, deliberate choice across her own years raising Marguerite and Julien to build something different with her own children, the bedtime reading, the honest conversations, the quiet nightly check on 2 sleeping faces that we witnessed at the very beginning of this story. Etienne listened to this admission with the same patient attention he has learned to offer his wife across their years together, and observed, gently, that whatever her mother's particular limitations, Isabelle herself had clearly succeeded in building something warmer with their own children, an observation that Isabelle received with a quiet, grateful relief, the specific comfort of having a long private effort finally, plainly acknowledged by the one person whose opinion on the matter mattered most to her. Her mother's visit concluded, in the end without any dramatic reconciliation or difficult confrontation, the 2 women simply continuing to relate to each other within the same careful, somewhat distant register that has defined their relationship for as long as Isabelle can remember. But Isabelle found herself, seeing her mother off in the courtyard on the morning of her departure, feeling something closer to genuine tenderness than she had expected, a recognition that her mother's reserve, whatever its cost to Isabelle's own childhood, had likely been shaped by pressures and disappointments of her own that Isabelle, even now, understood only partially. She embraced her mother at the carriage door with more warmth than either woman typically extends, and her mother, visibly startled but not displeased, returned the embrace for a moment longer than strictly necessary before composing herself again into her usual careful formality and climbing into the waiting carriage. Isabelle thought about this small unexpected embrace for days afterward, turning it over during quiet evening hours much like the ones we have spent together throughout this story, and she found herself arriving, eventually, at a particular understanding that she has carried with her since, that love within a family does not always arrive in the shape one hopes for or expects, that her own mother's reserved, correct affection was, in its own limited way, still a genuine form of love, however difficult it had been for a younger Isabelle to recognize it as such, and that the warmer, more openly demonstrative version she has worked so deliberately to build with her own children represents not a rejection of her mother's example, but simply a different, equally valid expression of the same underlying devotion, adapted to Isabel's own particular temperament, and to the particular lessons she chose to draw from her own considerably more distant upbringing. This small piece of private reckoning has settled, in the months since her mother's visit, into something Isabel now carries with a quiet, steady peace, rather than any lingering, unresolved ache. One more thread woven into the accumulated fabric of this particular year, alongside Claudine's happiness and the dowager's gentle softening, and the sapphire necklace and the lost pregnancy still held gently rather than fully released, all of it forming, together, the genuine, complicated, deeply human texture of a life that from any great distance might appear to be nothing more than gilt and mirror and careful performance, but that reveals itself, on close and patient examination, to be considerably richer, considerably more ordinary, and considerably more precious than any distant grandeur could ever fully capture on its own. One more evening deserves a place in this telling, a quieter one than most, arriving toward the very end of this particular year, when the household gathered, as it does most nights, for the simple ritual of settling into sleep. Isabel found herself, this particular evening, sitting a while longer than usual at her dressing table after Claudine had gone, not from any restlessness, but from a kind of contented stillness that seemed to want a little extra time before surrendering to sleep. She looked at her own reflection in the low candlelight, the same mirror that had shown her, a year earlier, that first cold thread of worry about age and fading currency, and found, tonight, that the worry had not vanished exactly, but had softened into something she could hold without flinching, a plain acceptance of a face that had lived a genuine year, full of real joy and real difficulty in roughly equal measure. She thought, in this quiet stretch, of everyone this particular year had touched, Claudine now planning her spring wedding to Mathieu, the dowager softer now than she had been 12 months earlier, Gregoire still tending his horses with the same patient devotion despite his persistent cough, Marguerite growing steadily into a young woman capable of asking honest questions and receiving honest answers, Julian still fiercely wonderfully himself, still resistant to Latin, still delighted by carved wooden animals and imaginary journeys to invented kingdoms. She thought of her own mother's brief unexpected embrace at the carriage door, and of the small folded letter from her father still resting in its locked drawer, and of the child she had lost, still loved, still gently carried, 2 years on now, in a private place that no longer ached quite so sharply as it once had. And she thought too of Etienne, asleep already in the next room, the same man who had admitted in a swaying carriage 11 years earlier that he hoped they might come to actually like each other in time, a hope that had grown, across more than a decade of shared labour and shared worry and shared quiet joy, into something considerably deeper and more durable than either of them could have predicted on that first nervous afternoon in her father's sitting room in Burgundy. Whatever this enormous, demanding, beautiful palace required of them both, whatever careful performance filled their days from the moment they woke until the moment they finally, gratefully closed their eyes each night, this particular thing, built quietly between the two of them across these 11 years, remained honestly, entirely their own, untouched by any of the surrounding machinery of appearance and hierarchy that governed nearly everything else about their lives within these walls. She blew out her own candle at last, the small flame guttering into darkness, and made her way, unhurried, toward her own bed, settling beneath the same fine linen sheets that had warmed her on the very first night of this story, and closed her eyes, ready now, finally, fully, to let this particular day and this particular year come to its quiet, gentle close. There is one final image worth holding on to before we finally let sleep take you fully, a small scene that has nothing to do with grandeur or ceremony at all. Picture, if you will, the apartment now in its full nighttime stillness, every candle extinguished except for the faintest moonlight through Isabel's cracked window, every member of this household settled into their own particular version of rest, the Marquise and her husband, their 2 children, the loyal servants who have shared so much of this family's daily rhythm across so many years, even old Gregoire out beyond the main building, his horses shifting quietly in their stalls through the long dark hours. Picture the corridor beyond their door, empty now, the elaborate sconces along its walls burned down to nothing, the whole enormous palace holding its breath in that particular way buildings seem to do in the deepest hours before dawn. Thousands of other rooms just like this one, each holding its own quiet accumulated story, its own particular mixture of performance and genuine feeling, calculation and real love. Picture the gardens beyond, dark and still, the fountains silent until morning, the geometric parterres reduced to shapes and shadows the way they were on that very first night we visited together. Picture the hall of mirrors, empty now, its hundreds of candles unlit, its endless reflective surfaces holding nothing but darkness, and the faint pale wash of moonlight through tall windows, waiting patiently for tomorrow's crowd of courtiers to fill it once more with light and noise and careful, ceaseless performance. And picture, if you can, this single quiet apartment among the palace's thousands of rooms, holding this one particular family, this one accumulated year of joy and worry and small unglamorous labour, finally entirely at rest. And somewhere beyond even the pond, out past the last careful edge of manicured garden, where the wilder path Isabelle once walked alone, begins its quiet drift toward the tree line. The night holds nothing at all but ordinary darkness, unremarkable and unwatched, the same darkness that settles every night over every garden and every home, grand or humble, across the whole wide sleeping countryside beyond this one particular palace's walls. Somewhere further still, past the edge of the formal gardens entirely, the small ornamental pond where Isabelle walked with her children back in the warmth of spring, lies dark and undisturbed, its ducks long since settled into whatever quiet corner of reeds and still water they favour for the night, the whole scene reduced now to a faint silver gleam under moonlight, patient, unremarkable, waiting the same way everything else in this enormous sleeping palace waits, for morning, for light, for the whole great machinery of ceremony and performance to begin again exactly as it always has. Even the small service passage behind the walls, so constantly busy through the ordinary daylight hours with footmen and trays and hurried whispered errands, lies entirely still now, its narrow corridor holding nothing but darkness and the faint smell of old tallow candles long since extinguished, waiting patiently for the earliest grey light of morning to set its whole quiet machinery back into motion. Down in the shared kitchen 2 floors below the family's own rooms, even Fournier's tireless fires have finally banked low for the night, the great ovens cooling gradually toward the faint warmth they will hold until the earliest kitchen staff return, hours before dawn, to coax them back to full life for tomorrow's breakfast. For this one stretch of night, though, even that relentless kitchen finally rests, pots and pans hung quiet on their hooks, the great scarred work tables wiped clean and empty, waiting. Even the horses in Gregoire's stable have settled fully now, their earlier restless shifting given way to the deep, steady stillness that marks true equine sleep, heads lowered, weight resting easy across 4 sturdy legs, the whole stable holding its own small pocket of quiet within the larger quiet of the sleeping grounds. Gregoire himself sleeps soundly above them, his persistent cough mercifully still for these few peaceful hours, one more small mercy among the many small mercies this particular night has offered to everyone gathered in their various rooms beneath this one enormous roof. The moonlight itself has shifted slightly across the floor since we first settled into this final stretch of the story, the particular pale rectangle it throws across the floorboards near Isabelle's bed, inching almost imperceptibly toward the wardrobe as the night continues its slow, patient turning toward morning. There is nothing dramatic in this small shift, nothing that any of the sleeping household would notice even if they were awake to see it. Simply the ordinary, ancient motion of the world continuing to turn beneath a sleeping palace, indifferent and constant, the same slow turning that has carried this particular family through 11 years of nearly identical nights, through joy and grief and the whole accumulated weight of an ordinary, extraordinary life. There is one more small comparison worth drawing before we let this household finally close its eyes. A comparison Isabelle herself has never quite put into words, but that seems to hover somewhere near the edge of her thoughts most nights at exactly this hour. The palace outside her window, for all its overwhelming scale, is really only a very large collection of very small rooms, each one holding its own small accumulated story, its own particular family or servant or solitary courtier, its own private griefs and joys, stacked quietly behind whatever grand public face that room happens to present to the corridor beyond its door. Versailles likes to be understood as a single vast, unified spectacle, one enormous performance of royal power radiating outward in every gilded direction, and in the daylight hours, moving through the hall of mirrors or the crowded gallery, it is easy enough to believe that version of the place entirely. But at night, in this particular quiet hour, the truth feels a little different, a little more forgiving. At night, the palace is not one story, it is thousands of stories, each one small, each one specific, each one mattering enormously to the handful of people living inside it, and scarcely at all to anyone else. Isabelle's own small story, the one we have followed across this single accumulated year, is simply one among that vast unseen multitude, no more or less significant in the palace's own indifferent reckoning than any other. And there is something in that thought, arriving now in these final drifting minutes, that Isabelle finds not diminishing at all, but strangely, deeply comforting. The knowledge that her own particular joys and worries, however consuming they feel from the inside, belong to a much larger, gentler pattern of ordinary human lives, quietly unfolding, night after night, behind 10,000 other closed doors, just like her own. Before we arrive at that final gratitude, though, let us linger one moment longer on the particular sound of this apartment settling fully into night, because it deserves to be heard clearly before it fades entirely. Somewhere in the walls, the old timber of the building shifts almost imperceptibly, the same faint settling creak that has marked the end of nearly every evening we have spent in this telling. The mantel clock in the sitting room continues its stubborn 4 minutes fast, ticking on toward a dawn it will always insist has arrived slightly earlier than it truly has. Beyond the window, the last carriage of the evening finally crosses the distant gravel drive, its wheels fading gradually into silence, the final small mechanical breath of a palace preparing, at last, to rest. There is a particular kind of gratitude that settles over a household at the very end of a long, full year, one that has nothing to do with counting successes against failures or triumphs against disappointments, and it is this quieter, more diffuse gratitude that seems to fill the Beaumont apartment tonight, in these final drifting minutes before full sleep finally claims everyone within it. It is not gratitude for any single grand achievement, no dramatic advancement at court, no single perfect evening that outshines all the others. It is instead gratitude for the accumulated whole of it, the ordinary Tuesdays alongside the grand balls, the quiet Sunday afternoons alongside the careful calculated visits, the small private griefs held gently alongside the small private joys, all of it woven together into something that feels, on this particular night, considerably larger and more substantial than the sum of its individual parts. Isabelle drifts towards sleep carrying this quiet gratitude with her, unspoken, unperformed, entirely her own, and it settles over the whole apartment like the last of the moonlight through her cracked window, touching every sleeping face in every room, Etienne beside her, Marguerite and Julien just beyond the wall, Claudine and Perrine in their own small shared quarters, and somewhere further off, old Gregoire among his faithful horses, all of them held, for these final quiet hours, within the same accumulated year, the same particular home, the same enormous, demanding, beautiful palace that has asked so much of them, and in its own complicated way, given back something genuine in return. This is nearly where we leave them, in this deepest, quietest stretch of night, a marquise and her marquise, their children, their household, all of them settling now into the same simple universal rest that awaits every person in every room across this enormous palace, regardless of rank, regardless of favour, regardless of how many careful calculations filled their particular day. Sleep, in the end, asks nothing of anyone that it does not ask of everyone else. No performance, no vigilance, simply the plain, patient surrender of a body finally allowed to rest after a long day's labour, however that labour happened to be spent. Let me offer one last small detail before we bring this particular story fully to its rest. Something Isabelle herself only half-consciously notices most nights, but that seems on this particular evening worth naming clearly. The candle beside her bed, The same modest single flame that has lit nearly every night we have spent with her across this telling, burns down now toward its final stub, the wax pooling unevenly around the wick the way it always does in these last minutes before it finally gutters out entirely. She has watched this same small process countless times across her 11 years in this apartment, thousands of candles now, each one burning through its allotted hours and then extinguishing, unremarkable, replaced tomorrow by another exactly like it, and there is something in this quiet, endlessly repeating small ritual that Isabelle finds herself appreciating tonight with unusual attention. The plain, humble physics of wax and flame continuing steadily onward, regardless of whatever grander dramas unfold within the light it provides. The portrait of her mother, barely visible now in the candle's failing light, watches over this room the way it has watched over every version of this room across more than a decade, through every joy and every private grief, through Marguerite's birth and Julien's, through the loss that still, some nights, surfaces quietly in memory, through balls and fireworks and ordinary Tuesday dinners, through Claudine's careful loyal service and her recent, well-earned happiness, through the dowager's slow decline and Gregoire's persistent cough, and every other small thread woven through this particular year we have spent exploring together. Isabelle has never fully articulated, even to herself, exactly what this small painted image means to her after all these years, beyond the simple, sufficient fact that it is the one object in this entire gilded apartment that connects her most directly back to the frightened 19-year-old girl who first arrived here from Burgundy, uncertain of everything, and who has become, gradually, across 11 patient years, the woman lying in this bed tonight, considerably more settled, considerably more capable, and, on balance, despite everything this demanding place has required of her, actually quietly content. The candle finally gutters out entirely as we watch, the small room dropping into full darkness broken only by the faint pale wash of moonlight through the window Isabelle keeps cracked even now, deep in this particular winter, and there is nothing more required of her tonight, nothing more to perform, nothing more to calculate or manage or carefully arrange. Etienne breathes slow and steady beside her, already deep in his own dreams. Marguerite and Julien sleep soundly just beyond the wall, watched over by Madame Fontaine's faithful attention. Claudine and Perrine rest in their own small shared room, and somewhere below, in the modest quarters above the stables, old Gregoire sleeps too, his faithful horses shifting quietly in their stalls through the long dark hours until morning. And beyond all of it, beyond this single apartment holding this single family's accumulated joys and griefs and quiet daily labours, the whole vast palace continues its own enormous, patient breathing through the deepest hours of the night, thousands of other rooms holding thousands of other private lives, each one, in its own particular way, carrying the same essential mixture of performance and genuine feeling, calculation and real love, that we have spent this evening exploring within these 5 familiar rooms. Versailles will still be standing tomorrow morning, exactly as it has stood for generations, its mirrors and gilt and elaborate ceremony resuming precisely on schedule, the levee, the promenade through the gallery, the careful daily choreography of an entire world built around the endless management of appearance. But for now, in this deepest, quietest stretch of night, none of that matters yet. For now, there is only this, a family finally at rest, a candle finally extinguished, a portrait watching quietly over a sleeping room, and beyond the cracked window, the vast dark gardens stretching out toward a horizon neither Isabelle nor anyone else in this enormous building will see again until morning finally, gently arrives. Sleep well wherever you are tonight, whatever room holds you, whatever particular accumulated year of your own life you carry with you into these quiet hours. Let the candle in your own mind gutter out too, now, slowly, the way Isabelle's has, and let yourself rest, fully, gently, the way this whole household finally has, here, at the end of one more ordinary, extraordinary day in a home at Versailles,